Okay, we're...
Just Kathy, that looks like March dropped off.
That's what I was just
Yeah.
about to say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of today's business. So the committee will receive oral evidence from the utility regulator for Northern Ireland on the PC21 mid-term review. We're going to receive oral evidence on the implementation of the Reservoirs Act Northern Ireland 2015, which will include an update on the reservoir regulations from the Department for Infrastructure and consider 5 related statutory rules. We consider 3 statutory rules and 1 proposal for statutory rule, which are subject to negative resolution procedure, and consider 1 statutory rule and 3 proposals which are not subject to any procedure, and consider written evidence from DFI on the launch of the public consultation on the active travel delivery plan. Excuse me. So just for anyone who's in the public gallery, you can use your mobile devices through a Wi-Fi connection. All devices should be muted. 3G, 4G and 5G should not be used, and no recordings or photographs are to be taken. So if members are content, we'll proceed through the agenda as follows. Apologies, Peter McReynolds.
Yep. Apologies, yep.
And Mark, I think, is having some tech issues. Maybe he's hoping to join us online, so hopefully he'll be here with us again shortly. Declarations of interest. We remind members that they are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests which might reasonably be thought by others to influence their approach under the matter under consideration. I'm asking members who have interest to declare in relation to today's business to do so now or when the particular matter arises in the meeting. So does any member have any interest that they wish to declare? I'm just going to declare, just because the utility regulator's in and we're discussing NI Water, just I do have family members that work for NI Water. Okay, happy enough to move on, yeah. Okay, item 3 is chairperson's business, there's none. Item 4 is the draft minutes at page 8, the draft minutes of the proceedings on the meeting on the 13th of November 2024, seeking agreement that members are content that the minutes are a true and accurate reflection of the meeting on the 13th of November 2024, and if so, I'll sign the minutes. Content?
Right.
Thank you. Okay, item 5 is matters arising. At page 3 of the table papers, you'll see the Minister of Infrastructure October monitoring outcome. Remind members that it was agreed last week to get a breakdown of the capital and resource funding allocated to the department in the October monitoring round. To be honest, members, I'm taking it that the gully emptying is a committee win, because that was something that has come up in committee before and we have requested, so it was good to see money allocated there. So I'm asking members if they're content to note the update from the Minister. Yeah. Thank you. Item 6 is correspondence. At page 16 you'll see the correspondence memo. At page 29, instruction to tenders for the 2018 DVA vehicle testing contract. Advise members that the department provided copies of the documents relating to the 2018 procurement process for the DVA vehicle testing contract. The instruction to tenders has been included in the meeting pack, and supporting documents were issued directly to members on the 15th of November. I know we talked about it in the past, but I'm suggesting that the committee ask DVA to provide a copy of the contract that was agreed with Worldwide Environmental Products as a result of the procurement process. Has any members anything that they want to comment on, or any issues that they want to... sorry, I'll take that first. Are you happy with that approach?
To request that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Massive members, have you any other comments you want to make on that? No. Have you any other comments or wish to raise any issue on any other item of correspondence? Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just the correspondence from the funeral directors. I think we've all been copied into another correspondence from a wedding hire car company, and it just does seem to be an issue with within the industry. So I'm just wondering, if there be any, how's that going to proceed, or what should we deal with that at some point? Will we?
Yeah, so we recognise it is an issue within the industry. I think that correspondence is going to come up in our packs next week. So we'll make a decision on that next week in relation to how we proceed.
Okay.
In relation to that, if members are content with that approach.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm seeking agreement that members are content to note the correspondence and the remaining suggested actions as contained in the correspondence memo in the meeting pack. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, item 7 is the utility regulator for Northern Ireland mid-term review oral evidence. At page 190 you'll see the clerk's memo. At page 194 you'll see the utility regulator for Northern Ireland mid-term review written evidence. At page 198 you'll see the utility regulator PC21 mid-term review final determination. And at page 270 you'll see the official report role and functions of the utility regulator 10th of April 2024. So we welcome to the committee again Mr John French, Chief Executive, Peter Russell, Executive Director for Price Controls, Networks and Energy Futures, Liam Cassidy, Director of Price Controls, and Kieran McCann, Head of Price Controls, Gas and Water. So members, as usual, I'm just seeking agreement that the evidence is recorded by Hansard. Agreed?
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay, so we do have obviously your written evidence. We have that in our packs and we have taken a look at that. So I'm just asking if you could have a brief opening statement for about 5 minutes, if you could. I'm very keen to come to members' questions in relation to it. So the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to attend the committee today and provide you with an update since we last met in April, which includes our overview of the final determination of our mid-term review for PC21. As the committee will be aware, as the independent economic regulator for water, the utility regulator's role is defined by statute, namely the Water and Sewerage Order of 2006. And within that, we're set 2 principal statutory duties: to protect the interests of consumers and to ensure the functions of Northern Ireland Water are properly carried out and ensure that Northern Ireland Water can finance those functions. We undertake our role through 4 main statutory functions. 1, price controls, which the midterm review forms part of, and this is a formal process that determines the revenue that Northern Ireland Water needs to provide efficient water and wastewater services through benchmarking and economic modelling. We also undertake licensing. Water and sewerage undertakings in Northern Ireland are prohibited activities under the legislation, and water and sewerage providers need a licence from the utility regulator to operate. We undertake disputes and appeals. We can make legal determinations on issues such as new connections and sewer adoptions. And finally, we undertake enforcement action to stop a breach of water and sewerage companies' licence conditions or statutory requirements. In addition to this, we monitor Northern Ireland Water's performance by analysing annual information returns and publishing annual cost and performance reports. As mentioned, we must act within our legislation, the Water and Sewerage Order of 2006, when determining the price control. We also must be mindful of the Northern Ireland Executive's endorsed Sustainable Water long-term water strategy for Northern Ireland that runs from 2015 to 2040, and also the short and medium-term requirements within the Department for Infrastructure's social and environmental guidance. Therefore, the utility regulator must ensure that Northern Ireland Water is provided with the revenue allowances which allow it to meet its statutory and environmental obligations. The utility regulator has always supported a fully funded price control to provide Northern Ireland Water with an efficient allowance to enable it to comply with its statutory duties. PC21 is our current and 4th price control for Northern Ireland Water, and it covers the 6-year period to March 2027. In May 2021, we determined the final determination for PC21 that Northern Ireland Water required 2.1 billion of capital investment to support and deliver an investment plan that was efficient and affordable from a tariff perspective. At the final determination for PC21, we also recognised there was a degree of uncertainty at the time about the allowances that were set, in particular relation to wastewater and sewerage schemes, and the need to deliver environmental obligations to address capacity issues in the network and release development constraints. So the midterm review provided Northern Ireland Water with a further opportunity to clarify its investment needs during the price control based on further investigations and studies completed in the first half of PC21. In undertaking the midterm review, we published the draft proposals in March 2023, and we undertake a period of public consultation in May of that year. We published a document explaining our approach to the midterm review in September 2023, and we finally received Northern Ireland Water's midterm review submission later that year. We have undertaken a detailed review of Northern Ireland Water's proposed changes across the wastewater enhancement programme, and we assessed Northern Ireland Water's claims for additional revenue that it needed for capital and operational expenditure. We made our draft determination on the additional revenue and assessed its impact. We also assessed any changes to the output targets and published our draft determination in May of this year. The reporter, who is an independent advisor, provided us with technical support through this to assess whether Northern Ireland Water's capital costs and ensure that our determination allowed for the appropriate levels of inflation across the UK water sector. We published our midterm review, the final determination of the midterm review on the 30th of September. And in this, we determined that there needed to be an increase in the capital allowance for Northern Ireland Water from £2.1 billion to £2.4 billion. This was needed to maintain existing services and deliver the upgrades required to meet its quality, environmental and service level obligations. This increase of £300 million from the May 2021 final determination was necessary due to the significant increases in inflation that occurred following the cost of living crisis. In terms of capital expenditure, Northern Ireland Water requested an additional £320 million on top of the £300 million I have just mentioned for above inflation capital increases. However, following our review, we could not see sufficient evidence to justify this claim. This accounts for the greatest proportion of the difference between our midterm review final determination of £2.4 billion and Northern Ireland Water's submission of £2.75 billion. In addition, we determined that average tariff increases of 4.5% were needed in the last 2 years of the PC21 period to March 2027. This was to account for the unprecedented increases Northern Ireland Water had seen in electricity costs, which have occurred since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And this equates to an increase of 75 million compared to the final determination in May 2021 of PC21. Also, on the back of more up-to-date information, we also determined limited adjustments to Northern Ireland Water's output targets. The midterm review process has also identified that further analysis will be needed on the cost escalations to fully establish why some of Northern Ireland Water's capital costs are higher than predicted. This work has currently been undertaken and will be taken into account at the end of the PC21 period when we analyse Northern Ireland Water's costs and performances. It will also be used to inform the next price control, PC27. The independent reporter is also providing professional advice and technical support on this additional work. Whilst ongoing government public expenditure constraints may affect the budget available to Northern Ireland Water, the utility regulator has no powers to legally take account of this potential impact when determining the midterm review. Our role as in statute is to ensure Northern Ireland Water is set a revenue allowance that is effective and efficient and allows it to meet its statutory obligations, taking account of Northern Ireland Executive's long-term water strategy and the Department for Infrastructure's social and environmental guidance. How this revenue is funded is ultimately a policy decision for government, and therefore it is for Northern Ireland Water and its shareholder, the Department for Infrastructure, to determine how they will meet this revenue allowance. that is needed for Northern Ireland to have clean drinking water and an environmentally compliant wastewater system. So that was just my overview, Chair, and we're happy to take questions on that.
Thank you very much. The committee is concerned, obviously, in terms of last week we were out at Myola, the wastewater treatment plant. We're concerned about the funding and how that's impacting upon people in Northern Ireland. I just wanted to kick off by asking about that additional money that Northern Ireland Water had requested, and then your own determination, which was increased to 2.4 billion. So what was Northern Ireland Water's rationale for the additional claim, and what evidence would the utility regulator need to see to be able to increase it with what Northern Ireland Water were telling you?
Do you want to go through?
Yeah, so we've already decided. We've made a decision on the midterm review, okay, on the basis of the evidence we've seen, and basically the issue was around cost pressures that are above inflation. Okay, so what we allowed was 300 million for inflation. There's an additional increment that we disallowed from 2.3 billion to 2.75, which we disallowed, and that's to do with the price inputs, okay, above inflation again, so capital price increases above inflation. And we've decided, and they're called real price effects, basically is the jargon that we use, and we have decided that there isn't evidence of real price effects, but we're undertaking further work with NI Water to understand what are the causes of that increase, that increment between 2.75 and the 2.4 we allowed, and we're hoping to conclude that early next year. So we're still trying to understand what are the causes of that balance.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did note with some concern in around we have NI Water's annual report, and in it Sarah Venning says that we are about to approach the point at which we are unable to recover delivery of PC21. This exposes the company to enforcement proceedings from the utility regulator. So will the utility regulator move to enforcement? Is that likely? And what does enforcement look like?
So,
Sorry, if you don't mind, I'm interrupting you. Mark's just joined us online. Mark, can you hear us? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mark.
Hey, Mark.
Sorry for
Unfortunately,
interrupting.
I thought you were going to struggle to hear me, but if that's sorted now, apologies. Sorry for being late.
The thumbs up will suffice, Mark. Good man.
Sorry for interrupting you. So that was will the utility regulator move to enforcement, and what does enforcement look like?
So in terms of enforcement at a high level, the utility regulator has statutory duties in terms of enforcement. So if we are convinced that there is a breach or the potential of a contravention, we have a duty to take enforcement action, not a discretion. So in the statute we have a duty. So at the minute we are looking at a number of potential enforcement actions associated in this sector. Our enforcement role is a statutory role, it's quasi-judicial, so we have to be quite circumspect in the evidence that we would give. However, what I can confirm, there are a number of potential enforcement actions sitting with our separate, we have a compliance and enforcement directorate, and they're sitting with them. What they will go through is through our published enforcement procedure, which starts with initial investigations right through to final determinations. What we have in our enforcement toolkit are a number of statutory instruments we can apply if we come to the end and conclude that there has been a breach. They range from voluntary undertakings to enforcement of statutory financial penalties, which are determined under financial penalties, secondary legislation, or the production of an enforcement order. If an enforcement order was to be put in place, it's a legal document which would outline the potential contraventions that we see and set a specific time frame for those contraventions to come to an end. and that enforcement order is enforceable through the courts at the end of the day. So that's the sort of sphere of where we can go. So there are a number sitting with the utility regulator at the minute, and they're sitting with the compliance and enforcement team who are working through the published procedure in terms of where they may possibly end up.
What is the number? Can you detail that?
Off the top of my head, without reverting back, we're sitting around 3 batches. So in those batches, there could be a variety, but there's 3 sort of high-level batches sitting with the enforcement team.
And enforcement is underway right now in relation to those 3 batches?
They are being dealt with by the Enforcement Directorate, who are working through the enforcement procedure. There are certain points at that procedure. We can very happily share that enforcement procedure with the committee if that would be a help, because what it does flag, it's quite a detailed procedure, but there's a flow chart, and that will flag at what particular point those actions will become public, and we will publicise them on our website. So it's the same across all the regulated sectors. So if that would be a help, we could forward that through to you to give you a better understanding of the process. It might sound like I'm being a bit vague, but because it's so judicial in nature, we have to be careful that we don't prejudice any stage of the investigation as we're going through it.
No, we understand. And what would be the time scale in relation to that?
Enforcements can range from 6 months to 24 months. It just depends. We've done a number over the years in terms of all the regulated sectors. What I could say to the committee is the majority of the enforcements that relate to NI Water are at the very early stages. Mm-hmm. So it's, for an example, if we send out initial inquiries, we get those initial inquiries back quite quickly, and we can make a very easy determination that there's a potential contravention. We can move quite quickly. If the situation is slightly more difficult in terms of the facts or the details, there may be an iteration of with to and fro with the regulated company to determine whether we need more information. We can issue statutory information requests called an Article 51 notice to demand the information if it's not coming. So we do have a wide range of statutory provisions which allow us to deal with enforcements and potential enforcements, and that's the stage that we're going.
Okay. If you could provide the committee with some evidence or some more information in respect of that, would be greatly appreciative. I suppose then that has such an impact on consumers and the constituents and ourselves sitting in this room. So what is your assessment of the longer term impacts of underfunding of PC21 and the future price controls as well? Because I'm assuming that you're looking towards the next price control as well. So what would be the longer term impacts?
I think, as I said in my previous evidence session, PC21 was the first of 2.5 price controls to get Northern Ireland Water up to where it needed to be, especially in terms of wastewater systems. If that funding isn't there, that process is delayed. So I'm sure you got from your evidence session with Northern Ireland Water, the impact of, especially clean water is okay. It's the impact of wastewater systems, and you've seen that in Lough Neagh, you've seen that in Belfast Lough, and one thing and another. So the lack of funding is just deferring Northern Ireland Water from getting to where it needs to be in terms of a modern and efficient wastewater system. I don't know if anyone...
Yeah, so I guess PC21 has been a process where we've gone through the business plan for the company, so that 6-year plan, and that's a large capital investment programme and the operational programme as well. So we've assessed that. Is that economic and efficient? Is that affordable? Is it deliverable? So we can't do everything within that 6-year window to get wastewater and water where it needs to be in terms of the legal obligations on the company. So it is going to be a couple of price controls. So the start of the price control was fully funded for the first couple of years, and then that's not the case now. So, but it's also not a case of just hitting pause in these projects and then being able to hit play again. There's obviously getting supply chain in place, getting all that program of work in place, and then if that's stopped, as I say, there's a lot of knock-ons there. It's not just simply, okay, we've had the monitoring round or we've had X, Y, and Z and now we have the money. So that is a difficult process to actually stop in the middle of a 6-year program. And you're absolutely right, Chair. It's a couple of price controls that we're talking about to get Northern Ireland to where it needs to be in terms of the legal obligations.
So then, again, from the Northern Ireland Water's annual report, it says we anticipate that it will take a sustained increase of investment over the next 18 years, plus to solve the problem of development constraints. So you would agree with that?
Yeah, so that would be 3 price control periods
Yeah.
there that we're talking about. So it is a long-term process. As I say, it's just not possible in terms of the supply chain to deliver all of that within 1 price control period.
And then lastly from me before I hand over to the Deputy Chair, I noted there in the course of what you were saying in terms of adoptions, and this is something that we have been discussing in the Assembly Chamber as well in terms of unadopted sites. And in Northern Ireland we have about 1,900 unadopted housing developments, which is an untenable situation for the homeowners, an untenable situation in terms of our infrastructure here in Northern Ireland. So you said that you have powers in relation to that. So what actual powers do you have, and can you step in on behalf of a homeowner in Northern Ireland, and have you done this before?
This goes back to one of our 4 statutory key functions, is the determination of complaints and disputes. So where the regulator can become involved in those sorts of situations, and we have done in the past, we published a decision as recently as May. We have a quasi-judicial role in the determination of a complaint and dispute. So if a developer or homeowner is having an issue in terms of their engagement with NI Water in terms of adoption, they can submit a complaint and dispute to the utility regulator, and that will follow a clean statutory process under which we will make a quasi-judicial decision either in favour of NI Water or the developer or homeowner, and that judicial decision is enforceable in the courts. So that's where the utility regulator can step in. Again, it's very statutory driven in process, but we have dealt with a number of these over the last sort of 18 months, and they will all be published on our website in terms of what we have determined. We need to go through quite a structured, it's like a mini court hearing in terms of the submission of evidence, the production of a statement of case, arguments to and fro, and then we will make a decision internally and publish that. So that's where the regulator can become proactively involved in particular circumstances.
And is that just Northern Ireland Water specifically? It's not against the developer?
No,
You know the way there's an issue between developer to Northern Ireland Water, so that is specifically to do with NI Waters?
Yeah, so the developer would, in real terms, the developer would submit a dispute or a complaint under our complaints and dispute process, and we would follow the statutory process through to determination either in favour of the developer or NI Water, depending on the circumstances of the case.
So going back to my opening statement, we can only deal with companies that we give a licence to. So that's why we cannot deal with developers. So we can only deal with Northern Ireland Water because we give them a licence to operate water and sewage services in Northern Ireland.
Okay, I'm going to move to the Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much, folks, for coming along today and again for the presentation. Like the Chair, I think we all have significant concerns about the impacts of underfunding and the long-term impacts that's having on economic development here, and also key executive priorities. And we could wax lyrical about all those. Utility Regulator, you referred in your report to the engagement with stakeholders outside of Northern Ireland Water and the department. Could you just outline who those are, what the outcomes of those stakeholder engagements are in terms of understanding the impact of the underinvestment, first of all?
It's on various levels, but I'll let Kieran.
Yeah, so I mean, it's on various levels, on various processes. I mean, it's part of the midterm review, which doesn't deal obviously with the impact of an underfunding. It's to do with what we believe is, a fair revenue allowance. We have engaged with CCNI, who've, consumer voice, NIAA, and the Drinking Water Inspectorate as the quality for water and environmental regulators. There's obviously DFI as well. So I mean, we carried out a very intensive process of engagement through the midterm review. With those parties and others as well, and we take account of various other wider sort of interests in our responses through our determination. And there's also other forums that we engage with those stakeholders as well.
So our process for the price control, we publish a draft determination once we've been through the business plan, and gone back and forward with the company to make sure that we fully understand it. And then as we're working through the benchmarking, and we come up with that draft determination, but that's then published for consultation. So we would get responses from that, which we assess and publish as well. I can't remember the numbers in terms of responses.
We had 5 responses to the mid-term review that we worked through.
Yeah, I think we had more at the initial price control setting. But we engage a lot through that process, and just in general there are a lot of bodies involved in this space, a lot of different regulators, as Kieran said there, but DWI, NIEA, there's and DFI, so a lot of different parties working together in this space.
Do you get a sense then from that engagement that the terrible situation that Northern Ireland Water's in and the impact it's having on economic development is truly being realised? In terms of just how significant and how big a crisis
I
is.
think there's any stakeholders that don't realise that. Yeah.
And I think perhaps testament to that, just to follow through, is the engagement we've had with stakeholders in relation to NI Water, and the wider contextual position in the last 24 months has been an absolute step change to maybe the previous 12 years when I've been the regulator. You can see very visibly, even in terms of engagement, in terms of potential enforcement, we would be talking to the other enforcement bodies in terms of what's anybody else doing, what are people looking at, so that there is no, there's no wasted enforcement, there's more strategic approach. And just more recently, we've had very proactive engagement with the Office of Environmental Protection, which has obviously come into the fore as another key stakeholder, so that the realm of stakeholder engagement in relation to this issue in the last 24 months is absolutely visible across the entire organisation.
Okay. Thank you. I'm moving on to another issue then. Whenever we raised with the Chief Executive last week about internal policy directives, particularly around restricting development in certain sites, I raised, for example, the like-for-like 5-year rule and how that impacts development of brownfield sites and economic potential sites. The Chief Executive wasn't able to tell me, A, why it was 5 years and not 10, and why that policy had been implemented, specifically who had implemented it. I'm just wanting to get your feeling on that. Is that something that you would cover as utility regulator, those internal directives, and is that something you've looked at all?
I don't think it's not something that we're familiar with, in depth. It's not really probably part of our role.
Just to talk you through the impact, a site sits there unused for 6 years. Someone wants to go in and development like for like in terms of the usage of the same amount of water turnover. It's an instant blanket ban, but there's a chance if it had been switched on again by the existing site, it wouldn't have been a problem. So it would open up the potential for those economic sites and those key industrial areas where people do want to invest at no additional impact to the system. But there's just a carpet ban there. You can understand why people who want to economically develop those areas are finding that frustrating, but can't seem to get any answers.
Yeah, I understand that's on the NIEA side, right. That assessment on that kind of site-by-site basis. So I guess that policy would be for NIEA, and I'm not kind of throwing that over the fence, but that's not part of our remit in terms of economic regulation and the price control process.
Okay.
But I understand the point.
Yep, okay. Well, moving on to one that hopefully is, whenever I did raise as well to the Chief Executive on case-by-case basis, for example, the special educational needs school in my constituency that had another instant ban on it because of the impact on the capacity issue, despite the fact that those young people would be in the same town. If they weren't at school, they'd be at home, so there'd be no additional impact. The Chief Executive said that would potentially be a matter for both the NIEA and the utility regulator to work with them hand in glove. Is that something you do in terms of those cases, or have been approached by Northern Ireland Water in conjunction with NIA to look at specific cases so that a flexible and not obtuse approach can be found on those applications?
I suppose taking yes, in a way, but it comes back to what we were saying earlier. We give Northern Ireland Water an allowance for its wastewater systems. Northern Ireland Water will see where in your constituency area it needs to be, the wastewater system needs to be strengthened and improved, and we'll give them a reason, an efficient allowance to improve that wastewater plant. The problem is we're not funding it to the level to allow Northern Ireland Water to undertake those works, and that's the problem we're finding ourselves in. So it's not that the utility regulator is saying no to Northern Ireland Water on this, it's that the funding isn't properly there for allowing that wastewater system plants to be upgraded to where it needs to be. I don't know the specifics, but that's what I would guess is roughly the answer, yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Cahill?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much. And John, to prefer and listen to all you said, I know before the Chair calls me on taking time to ask the question, this is a very important subject. But we are where we are in terms of PC21. We've done the review, and we have a few years left on it, so we have to accept that and appreciate we're all saying it's underfunded, but we are where we are in terms of agreed. My first question is, because following on from the development issue, because we're getting it as elected reps, in your assessment now, do you think that the environmental targets are being prioritised over development? Now, you may not be able to answer that, but my question is, because we received a presentation last week and we are trying to meet our climate change targets, which 100%, but is that being prioritised over actual development? Because there's more sites that's sitting there in your assessment at this midterm.
I wouldn't have that data to give you a straight answer, but I don't know if any of the gang.
No, I mean, it's again, it's not information that we would have. I mean, again, it's like John said earlier. I mean, what happens under the price control is we get the assessed need. You know, it covers various things like drinking water quality, the environment, cover
I appreciate
constraints, and then we say.
Right, well, I'll move on to the next question because it's important. But we can't all be operating in silos here. I appreciate you have a job of work, but we collectively have to get the L in this here.
I agree with you.
Because the point now, my next question is, you've allowed an extra, because we signed off on the PC21 at 2.1. We've now given midterm another 300 million, yeah? So what I'm reading from the PC21, which was clearly identified following a determination from yourselves that this is the programme of work, allowing inflationary prices, so we've allowed another 300, is that right? Is that just to meet the inflation over the last number of years, or other factors?
That's just for inflation, so
Okay.
it's been updated for inflation. So
So
prices.
in reading that, the original programme PC21 should be then, that's the 6-year programme. That's what your determination is, right? So then at that, because the question then is, when you say they need more funding, they come with a plan and you agree to plan, and that was the plan of action. Every department's asked for more money, that's the way it is. But I'm saying to you then, by what you've allocated, they should be able to fulfil this programme under the original determination.
Yes.
Right or wrong?
Fully funded.
That's fair enough?
Yes.
Okay, right. And my final question, Chair, because I've loads I could ask.
No, you're grand.
Just in terms of data itself, in your assessment, have NIW got all of the data to do the proper modelling, do you feel? Presented to yourselves? Is that
In terms of that price control plan,
in rolling out, you know, yes, exactly, in terms of the PC,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
is there any issues over the data?
no, so as I say, that's a long process going through that 6-year business plan and saying this is going to deliver the long-term water strategy, this is going to be a couple of price controls to get us where we need to be, and this is what's deliverable in the first 6 years. So that's funded in the first couple of years. Coming to your earlier point about the mid-term view, that's a normal part of the process.
Absolutely,
so we
yeah.
say 6 years, but obviously things change. A lot of that was energy costs going up. So Water are the largest electricity user in the country. So that's what was factored in there as well.
No, appreciate just finding the real price effects. Obviously, you've noted in the thing. You want to comment any more in relation to that, or is there?
So we've
For
made
our committee, is this
so
something we
we've
should-
made a final determination on the real price effects, and there's an increment of money, which is the 300 million above the 2.4. We've said that's not real price effects. It could be something else, and we're working with NI Water at the minute to understand what the cause of that increase is. So we haven't.
I appreciate your just one final point. I mean, we've had 3 price controls, or we will have. By the time this started in 2007. So I appreciate there's not.
Fourth one, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So this is the 4th one. So, okay, sir. Thank you. Yeah.
It's just taking back to the real price control.
Yeah.
We're trying to work out why. So, in terms of monitoring and modelling, we don't understand why Northern Ireland Water believes they need that additional money. So that's the work with the reporter, that's the work with our own team to understand, is there specifics within the water industry that are rising at a higher price than inflation, than normal inflation levels?
No, you understand the point, but it will inform the next PC.
It will,
Yes,
yes.
that's the point.
Absolutely.
Fair enough.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Cahill. Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Just when you were talking there, you mentioned the reporter, and I'm just trying to sort of get my head around that. I suppose, Ray, how does what's they always have an expertise, if that makes sense, but is it just, I mean, how much expertise is that? Is that something that has worked in the industry before? Is it sort of duplicating? Is it going through with defined operational procedures, or is it just a financial look at it, or what? If that makes sense. So it's really just, how are they analysing the data, and how do they focus on, how do they conduct their work with the reporter?
So it's basically a technical audit. So it is.
Okay.
So you've got a team.
They're a team, sorry?
Yeah, well, it's a reporter, and then you've got people working for the reporter, and they would go into NI Water, and they would understand NI Water's processes that are underpinning, the increases in cost. So it's quite a sort of technical audit, basically, of NI Water's processes to make sure that they're accurate and efficient, and it's really sort of one of the big sort of tools that we have in our cost scrutiny and outputs toolbox to assist us in scrutinising NI Waters, and it's independent as well. So and they have a primary duty of care to us as a regulator.
It's kind of like an external auditor, essentially.
Yeah, it's an external auditor.
Yeah.
It's a common process in water regulation and rail regulation. It gives you that insider view of the organiser. So they've got access to all Northern Ireland Water's data, and it's just that, as Kieran and Peter were saying, it is like an auditor to make sure that when Northern Ireland Water is saying they need X, that they've independently checked, and they've got the engineering expertise and the industry expertise to say, looking across to other jurisdictions and saying, yeah, that's fair enough, or it's not fair enough, or there could be what Northern Ireland Water is proposing is efficient, or it's not efficient. They're not looking, there's better technology out there that they could be using. So it's that kind of insider within the organisation that's given an independent view to what Northern Ireland Water are suggesting is needed.
So following on, just again, we were at the Moyle water treatment, and then I water there, and they explained to us how efficient they were, if that makes sense. But there's obviously maybe a sort of discrepancy there, according to this, the reporter. So it's really, how does that then? How are these differences resolved, and what sort of goes on, and I mean, what's the to and fro then in this methodology in order to sort of come to an agreement or try to come to an understanding, because there obviously is a difference here, The
reporter, so quite a lot of regulators across the water have moved away from the reporter and are now moving back. So the reporter is like an internal technical eyes and ears. One of their primary jobs is to help inform the UR in terms of NI Water's delivery of our statutory objectives and NI Water statutory objectives. So they're like an internal view, and so one of their actions is to take a detailed look at NI Water's annual performance statement. They'll also take an internal detailed look at NI Water's midterm review, business plan submission, and all those sort of internal things, so that when they get to the regulator, NI Water have had their say, the reporter has their say, and then it comes to us as an independent economic expert to determine. So it's not that there's necessarily an agreement reached at any particular size. We then look at the evidence presented, with everybody having had the opportunity to sort of, well, I say everybody, NI Water and the reporter haven't had the opportunity to say their piece, and then that's where our role really adds value, because we come in as the independent economic expert and look at that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess it's different where you would maybe in other regulated spaces have a third party consultancy come in, one of the big four, whoever, engineering consultancy come in, try and get up to speed with the company and answer the questions that we have. So it's somebody who understands the processes and is kind of embedded and can take best practice from elsewhere and say, actually, this is not efficient. And the committee's heard evidence from NI Water of the closing of the efficiency gap, so that 49% gap that was there, and over the last couple of price controls, that's now down, that's essentially gone. It's down to 6%. So the reporter helps in that process, helps understand the internal workings of the company, and then can report to us with the detail, instead of it purely being economic regulation, there's a big asymmetric information problem. So the company has all that information and we're trying to get it. So instead of us going back and forward requesting information, the reporter's kind of embedded and can really get to the bottom of it a lot quicker, if that makes sense. Yeah.
One more, yep. Just again, I suppose looking at the future, really. Just how do you guys anticipate the future price control periods and increased funding in order to fill Northern Ireland Water to fulfil its obligations to the Climate Act? You know, that's obviously something big coming down the road too. So, just what is there an opinion on that?
So we always set price controls on a forward-looking basis, you know, so it's forward-looking, and we set a price control at the upper revenue allowance that we believe that NI Water will need to fulfil its statutory duties. I suppose it may be helpful if I go back slightly in terms of why we've got to where we've got to. So when the water order was introduced in 1st January 2007, it set all the obligations that NI Water, the vast majority of the obligations that NI Water would have to comply with in the legislation. And that legislation always envisaged domestic water charging coming into play within a 3-year period. So those obligations and statutory duties were set in 2007 at this level, but with the anticipation within 3 years it would be fully funded in a different mechanism. Unlike other regulated entities, NI Waters, the vast majority of their obligations are in legislation. Majority of our other regulated entities, the vast majority of their obligations are in licences. So what we can do as a regulator is we can amend the licences, so we can essentially lower the bar on occasions if necessary. Because of the different context here and the legislative framework, that's kind of how we've got to where we are. So when you level on top of all those already legislative obligations, the new climate change, road to net zero targets, that's adding on a different level of obligation that we will have to consider when we're setting the price control at the upper revenue allowance to concur with statutory compliance, if that makes sense. So there's no choice but to factor in the Climate Change Act targets.
It's prioritising, that's the question I asked. What you're saying, it is prioritising the climate targets from day one.
Prioritising the statutory obligations.
Sorry, yeah. I'm just saying, that's the question I asked.
So anything that's in statute has to be prioritised. That's how it is.
That's the question I asked.
Andrew?
No, Chair, yep.
Okay. Keith?
Okay, thanks for coming along. My question relates to your document where it states here, utility regulator is obligated to protect the interests of consumers in relation to supply of water and the provision of sewage services. Okay, so you, John, I'm looking, I suppose, directly to you as utility regulator. Are you content that NI Water is doing that, providing consumers with sewage services? And what's the definition, and when does a consumer become a consumer? So it's a bit to pick on John's point. NI Water is not providing sewage connections, okay? And are you content as a regulator that they should be obviously providing sewage services, okay? But at what point do you regulate? When that connection becomes connected, or prior to that, or the whole piece?
Well, it's the whole piece, really. Sorry, trying to break down your question. Are we satisfied? Well, that is going through, as Elaine had mentioned earlier, a compliance and enforcement process. Northern Ireland Water directors have stated that they cannot meet their statutory obligations, so we'll have to investigate that and come out to a conclusion, and that process is ongoing at the moment. So, you know, Northern Ireland Water's directors themselves are saying they're not meeting their statutory targets, so that's quite clear. In terms of connections to the, as Elaine said, we have a legal duty to make sure that Northern Ireland customers can connect to the network. The problem is we've got a sewage system that is unable to deal with those connections.
John, you see, sorry for cutting across you. Last week, Sarah Venning made the point, and I referred to if there was no rain in Northern Ireland as a crazy idea. So they're concerned with combined storm overflows. So the system can cope today if it didn't rain, theoretically. So they're focusing on the rain to prevent the combined storm overflows. But that doesn't allow one more house, or John's point about the people using the toilet in Carrickfergus, or the toilet in the house, or the toilet in the school. It's not additional people. So the rules is no more connections. So the environment's important, but they're not looking at this sensibly. But can you do more policing of them to say, why is making that idea? why he's making that decision, because it's fundamentally wrong. It's fundamentally breaking the provision of sewage services. And appreciate if they're bringing in more people into the town and you're building another 100 houses, that's somewhat different. But if there's a house there and you go by the 5-year rule, or you don't let the school be built, because they're blankly saying no more, but they're focusing solely on combined storm overflows. That's what they're focusing on. And they're saying no. So my question to you is, are they providing sewage services based on you being the police officer for that?
Clearly they're not.
So what can you do to them to, in other words, analyse, for example, if you look back at 100 planning applications, Chair, in different areas, you would see no, no, no. But you'd say, that doesn't make sense. That no is a no because it's easy to say no. Never mind the developer having to pay a fortune of money to get the no. But some of those no could be a yes. So how do you police that, John, to look at that in the broader picture to say, you've been too rigid here, you are the police officer. We're pushing to say we want environmental protection, we want development, we want both, which is difficult. But they're wooden and no, and they're using the wooden no to beat us over the head and to beat development over the head. But there's no reason for the no.
Do you want to explain the dispute process?
Yeah, so if we go way back to just your very first point about when does a consumer become a consumer? It's all very... Article 6.3 of the Water and Sewage deals with consumers, and consumers are dealt with in a slightly different context here in Northern Ireland than they would be by Ofwat across the water, because a consumer is traditionally seen as somebody who pays for the services, and that's when you become a consumer. But our legislation...
Sorry, whenever you do pay?
Yeah, but our legislation is different.
Okay.
So just to so consumers are consumers who use the system in
Okay.
Northern Ireland. So I think that's important. So you don't become a consumer when you start to pay. So it's not.
So technically, just to get that clear, everybody in Northern Ireland is a consumer?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So which is different than
Okay.
across the
Which
water.
is a benefit to us, okay? For
So
yeah.
that's so there is obviously then this if we look, we all appreciate the context we're in terms of funding and that wider social context. There's a pull between the legislation stating that everybody in Northern Ireland is a consumer and has a right, and the real life situation where there's not enough funding. As a regulator, our duty is to ensure that those consumers defined in Article 6, that the price control that we allow sets an upper revenue allowance for those consumers to receive every single service that they should under the terms of the legislation. So we set that allowance here. There is no obligation in law for that allowance to be mandated to be met. We look at it and say, for all consumers in Northern Ireland, we believe this is the level of revenue required for the next price control period to allow those services to be met. Once we set that upper revenue allowance, we don't have the ability to get in and determine exactly what NI Water do. You know, we don't have the ability to produce legally binding outputs on the company, which again is different to England and Wales. They do, as a regulator, have the ability to set legally binding outputs on the company. So where we can come in is if there is a complaint and dispute from a developer who is not receiving the services that they believe they're legally entitled to under legislation, or if we're informed of a potential breach in terms of enforcement. So long answer to your question is, where can we get involved? We can't get involved in individual instances of telling the company how they run their business, but what we can do is when people come to us via a quasi-judicial complaint and dispute or a potential enforcement issue, then we have statutory powers where we can get involved.
So fundamentally, picking on a last point, if I may, if pick John, the school, okay, which is not obviously a developer, but let's say the school, whoever's building that EA or whatever, come to you and said, no, we should be allowed to build this school, what's the reason? The EA could come to you and you could have a conversation about that, and that's probably a good case to pick on instead of a developer building an additional 100 houses. So can that EA go to you and say, why are you stopping that? You then could have a conversation with NI Water as the regulator.
So in a short answer, yes, but it's slightly more complicated because they would come to us and say, this is the problem we have. Because we're a creature of statute, we will say, right, let us consider whether we have the statutory powers to deal with this. And then we would go through quite a formal process with the school and the applicant from the school and NI Water to ascertain whether NI Water were delivering on the statutory obligations that we said they should have been fully funded for. And then we would produce a determination in that role.
And final question, if I may. Final question.
Are
you content that NI Water is doing all it can with what it has got to do what it can, and obviously be a bit more flexible? It's a wouldn't know, and I think they're wrong in some instances.
We couldn't say we couldn't say for your constituency whether they were doing that, but overall, Northern Ireland Water have become more efficient. So going back to 2007, for every pound that an efficient company in GB was spending, a water company in GB was spending, Northern Ireland Water was spending virtually £2 to achieve the same thing. Now that for every pound an efficient company in GB is spending, Northern Ireland Water is spending £1.06 to get to the same level. So they're there or thereabouts in terms of overall efficiency. Now whether your constituents, they're more efficient in your constituency area compared to your constituency area, we wouldn't have that level of detail. You know, we would be looking at the overall Northern Ireland picture.
But again, that's back to it'll take a couple of price controls. So as Chair said, it was 18 years. So that's 3 price controls to get all of Northern Ireland to where it needs to be. So it's that big programme of work that's now been paused.
What can you do, John? What can you do to overarch look from a consumer point of view at NI Water to see the decisions they're making? What can you do?
Sorry, in terms
So,
of
so in other words, you're looking at all of consumers. So everybody in Northern Ireland is a consumer of NI Water, technically. What can you do to protect those consumers based on some of the decisions NI Water are making to disadvantage some of those consumers?
Well, eventually, as Elaine said, so we set the revenue that they need to meet, you know, the guidance that's set out, you know, the social environmental guidance and the strategy and the legislation. If they don't do that, we would then start slowly going through the enforcement and compliance procedures. So eventually we will have to say Northern Ireland Water, you know, if Northern Ireland Water aren't achieving what they're set out to achieve, it'll eventually become to a breach of licence, and we'll have to go through the legal process with that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Chair, this is vitally important.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, what you're saying is we have a PC programme that's predominantly achieving its climate targets as opposed to development, growth and economy. If you look at it, if you analyse it that way, but you explained it. Yeah. They have to meet their targets. That was the question I've asked you. So how did we develop, and that's why I'm saying we can't operate in silos here. We have to have the broader conversation. But planning then, councils won't be able to give permission for planning, but they'll not be able to connect to the system. All I'm saying to you, the consumers don't seem to be getting a fair crack of the whip here because under obligations, NIW have to commit to climate targets. That's my reading of it.
Just to clarify, I agree they have to commit to the legislative targets set in all legislation. Climate targets don't have any higher precedence over their statutory obligations in terms of connections, and I think they're all equal.
But if you look at this PC programme, that's the way it's run now. Because that's my look on it. That's all I'm saying to you. So we have to include all of that because there's no development. Sorry, Chairman, just going.
Thank you. It is important, and it's a major issue affecting all of our constituencies, and we're all feeling it. That's the thing. Can I just check what financial penalties can you enforce upon? Is there a range?
Yeah, there's a range. It's laid out in the statute, so it's in the financial penalties regulations. I think it's 2015, but I can check that and come back to you. But there's a statutory formula laid down in secondary legislation whereby if we get to a point where we determine that a financial penalty is appropriate, then you'll work through the formulae and the regulations to get to a point. So we don't just sort of make it up. We work through the statutory formula to get there.
Okay. Mark, I'm just checking. I don't see your hand up, but I just want to check so that you're not feeling left out. Do you want in?
That's very considerate of you, Chair. Thank you. Well, most of the points I had been going to make, if not all, have been. I'm sorry I missed the start of it, so I missed the names of all the people on there to give evidence, but thank you. What I've caught has been very good. You'd said there about setting an upper revenue allowance for Northern Ireland Water. Do you also set a lower revenue allowance for Northern Ireland Water?
No.
So the idea of price controls is that the company should try and beat that upper limit. So that's how efficiency is brought into price controls. So each time there's an upper limit set, the company then tries to beat that over the period of the price control, and then those efficiencies are baked into the next price control. So that's how companies are meant to become more efficient over time. It's meant to be that you set the upper limit, companies try and beat that, and then in the next price control you swallow what they've beaten and make the company more effective for the next price control, and that's the process that goes on. So you can see how companies over time become more efficient because of that process. So it is, you look at the world.
Yeah, but do you understand what I mean? Around the lower one, was there ever a limit identified that this is a bare minimum that would be required?
Sorry.
Sorry, it's terminology here, I think.
When we set the upper revenue allowance, we don't allow for any fat per se. Do you know, we're not saying this is what we think the upper limit is, but there's a bit of scope in there. And we set the upper revenue allowance at what we believe factually to deliver the programme. So we don't say, well, factually that, but we'll add another 5 or 10% just in case. That's set at what we believe the parameters are for delivery. So in one way it's the upper limit but the lower limit, if you know what I mean.
Mark, did
The
you
limit?
do you mean in terms of the budget available? Like, do you mean that? Do you mean trying to set a lower limit that way?
Yeah. No,
Well,
I
I
think
guess-
it's been explained. I've got it. I've got it. And I think I had it anyway. It was just for a confirmation on that there isn't any fat in what is set. You know, and that this is the basic requirement to carry out your statutory functions, basically.
And then the company's then
And
trying
then-
to get more efficient over that 5-6 year period.
Yeah, and in terms of the improved efficiency, John, you done that comparison and read across with, I think, was it efficient English companies?
Yeah.
And now for every pound an efficient English company would spend, Northern Ireland Water would spend maybe £1.06. I think you said to do the same. So they've closed that gap. They've become more efficient. But just in that example, how is efficient defined? You know, in that respect, you know, as regards to the English company, it's an English company doing the same thing or a similar thing, I would presume. And you know, as efficient is that around how effective they are as well, or just how good they are at balancing the books?
So I guess, Mark, in England and Wales that we're using as a comparison there are a lot of water companies. So the regulator there is able to compare the performance of all of them. So that's why we're using that as the example, because we just have the one company here. So regulation, we regulate these monopoly companies in energy and water because competition's not there. So if there was another Northern Ireland Water company that was competing with Northern Ireland Water, they would have to, that's where you would get that efficiency through competition. So that's why we are setting the price controls. So we're kind of the quasi, you know, function there for competition. We're driving down the prices through economic regulation.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark.
No, and then maybe just one other one in terms of commercial water rates. Would you have much of a role or oversight in what Northern Ireland Water do in that regard to business or with business customers?
Can I explain the tariff process?
So look, we've got so basically we set the revenue allowance, okay. So the whole revenue allowance for the price control, and then that's split out, okay, into tariffs. So there's a proportion which goes to then of that revenue to non-domestic consumers, and we set a non-domestic tariff, and then the rest of the revenue, you know, should be recovered from domestic consumers, but obviously there's no water charging. Yeah, so that's it. So we set a tariff.
Okay.
So.
Okay, thank you, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other. Sorry.
Yeah, Chair, if I may, just to come in just on two final points, if I
Very
may.
briefly,
yes,
if you
John.
could.
Just in terms of the reporters' engagement, you mentioned that he or she would look internally at the organisation and how it operates logistically, and maybe sometimes compare that to international models of best practice. I'm just wondering, has there been any feedback given from examples elsewhere around the world about how really well systems of processing water have been could be replicated here, and how easy that conversation has been had with Northern Ireland Water? Is that something that happens on a regular basis?
Well, I think that's part of the reporter's job. You know, as we were explaining earlier, you know, we've got a reporter who has, you know, real sort of auditing and technical engineering expertise, so they're using their experience.
But they compare models of best practice from around the world to apply them to how Northern Ireland Water's doing it, and then feed that back to say what they could be doing better.
Exactly, they're using their expertise from looking at other companies, across the water and elsewhere, and then applying that practice.
Okay, but just to check that it is not just across the water, but it's around the world. There are other examples around the world that do things much differently and often much more efficiently, and so that is fed back. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
The report, although it's singular as a reporter, they're generally part of a bigger organisation that has that, that background.
Okay. And the final point, Chair, if I may, when we heard from the Construction Employers Federation, they give us chapter and verse on the frustration that developers are having between the delays with NIEA and Northern Ireland Water when it comes to developer-led solutions to wastewater. I'm just wanting to know, is there any feedback you could be given or any oversight you give in terms of why that process takes so long, is so laborious, and also in their statutory requirements to consult on planning applications, even though it's invariably no, it still takes an age. I mean, is there something more from a regulation point of view that you could be sent to them to speed things up in that, to become more solution friendly?
We've got no duties in terms
None
of
whatsoever.
No, we're just purely looking at the economics of the company.
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Look, thank you very much for coming to us. It'd be great in terms of that enforcement piece if we could get some more detail on that, because I know as a committee we'd be really, really keen to see where that's heading and what happens there in relation to that as well. So we will follow up with you in relation to that. But look, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate you coming in and for your evidence today. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, members, was there anything else anybody wanted to raise coming out of that?
I'd like to get more info on the question you asked relating to unadopted sites and where they can play a quasi-judicial role, as they said. I'm still a bit of ambiguity in how that actually could be the site solution. Because they can only take action when NI Water are fault, but NI Water says it's not my role until it's currently finished. So I don't see that there is an option there.
It would be good to see, I suppose, and they did say it is online, but it'd be good to try and see the examples of where that has maybe happened before, and even the numbers of where it has been successful.
And Keith's point was really well made too.
Yeah, I think get a request in terms of the numbers and say the last 5 years perhaps, to see has the utility regulator, or even I suppose over the price control period. I was just in there in terms of the price control period, maybe to see if there has been figures in relation to that. Cahill?
And listen, nobody has any issues with climate, so I want to put that in the record in case anybody says. They've obligations there. My point was trying to find out exactly where the PC was going. It would be quite interesting, Chair, to see if we could find out any more about the reporter and access to information. Are we allowed to ask that question? Or can we?
They did say there in their evidence session that person is like an external auditor and they have access to NI Water's
that's the same
data and
is
things
anything
like
we
that.
can,
so
is anything we can glean out of it? I mean, that's like the only point is that we understand that the utility regulators' role, and they've signed off on PC 21 now. They've done the midterm review. The obligations on the climate change targets, we're all getting it about development and everything else. So we're only trying to marry it all up and see exactly where it's at. But now if the reporter, if it's a good enough programme in terms of if the reporters get inside and seeing all the evidence and all the data and the PC stands up, that's 100%. But as far as we're concerned, are we entitled to ask?
Well, we can ask. So is your request to contact the reporter directly or contact through NI Water?
Yeah, are we allowed to see what the role is and how, or can we ask any questions? No.
Is it more information on their role or on
what they're entitled to do, what the role is,
and what information they're entitled to see? Are you wanting to see that information or just know what they're entitled to see?
No, as long as it's robust enough to stand over the PC. I mean, that's their, they've been inside and done that.
Yeah. So we can check that in through via
what we're allowed to ask and what we're not doing.
Okay, Keith?
Yeah, John made the point at the very, very last that they're regulating from a financial point of view.
Yeah.
More broadly, right?
Yeah.
So who's policing NI Water?
That's the point, Keith, I was trying to get to. There's a bit of ambiguity here and also a narrowness to the role. I respect fully the role of the UER and his office, but the last point, for example, is still an issue of policing.
Yeah.
Who's policing the aspects that the UER doesn't? Theirs is very related to the area around price control, but as Keith pointed out, the consumer is everyone. They say they're there to protect the consumer, but when it comes to the issues relating to delays or not accessing sewage facilities, they can't because it's not their remit, but it's not anybody else's. So then it falls into the cracks and we never find a solution.
There's a gap.
There's an absolute gap.
Unless the developer of the school, which is not a developer, but the person building the school goes to them and say, what's the reason for this? Yeah. Somebody has to complain to them that NI Water's not doing their job.
Able to do, and that's the point, Chair. And that's why it was hard to tease out the environmental stuff. Nobody has any issues with environment.
No.
But it's that part. How the utility.
I think the school's a very good example because it's not a development, it's not a financial benefit, it's purely a school.
As are the like for like sites, and again, we can't get any clarity on why that policy's there and who implemented it and why it's been justified.
I'm finding it bizarre that nobody seems to be picking this up. No. It doesn't seem to have come up with NI Water. It doesn't seem to have come up with the utility regulator in terms of the stakeholder engagement piece. It seems strange.
We could talk about this all day, but it's such a massive piece here.
We're only trying to tease out exactly what's what.
But back to that point last week, I asked the Chief Executive of Northern Ireland Water why the like-for-like 5-year policy was there, why it wasn't 10 or 15 years, what legislative backing was for it, and there were no answers. But that's the Chief Executive of the organisation. A critical point, restricting economic development, and no one knows why it's there, who put it there, and whether it's justified. But that's got to raise serious red flags. It may well be justified, and it might not need to be 10, but it has to be 5, but no one knows. And no one's overseeing it.
So I think as well, that's a point. Last week we were keen to get NIEA in with NI Water, and I think that's a key question, and I think for that whenever they come in to the committee in relation to that, because we really need to tease out, is it NIEA who are holding that back, and where does that policy fit in? So I think it's key. Maybe if we keep those there for that session with NIEA, does that make sense?
And that's important, Chair. If NIEA come in and say, here's environment target, this is the prioritisation, 100% nobody's arguing, but you need to go back and answer the question why the school hasn't been built, why it hasn't been connected. Do you understand me? Through the PC programme. And let's get all that teased out, and the sooner we have a conversation, the better.
Yeah,
I think it's important that session, the NIA and NI Water session, is a longer session than normal, because there's a lot and I think it'd do no harm on this occasion, and I know we shouldn't be sending questions prior, but it'd do no harm to send some information. We want to talk about this and this.
What's going on.
You tell them,
we might
not questions, but areas of topic. They'll have a fair idea what we want to cover.
So I'll come to it in the forward work programme, but next week we will be looking at taking stock at where we are at, and potentially next week we could have a discussion around some of those elements in relation to what we actually want to delve into. And if you could, Keith, if you don't mind, hold on to that thought for next week, because I think it's important that as a committee we have and we're getting the most out of the sessions. But I would agree with you, this is such a huge issue. Look, we're already over time in relation to the utility regulator, and there was so much that came out of that session even today. So
Chair, sorry, before we move on, can I just ask, do you want to, I know that there are obviously questions for NIE and NIW as you've talked about in their session, but do you want to write in the meantime to DFI to ask who is policing the NI Water's procedures and decision making? Is that what you want to ask? Yeah, okay.
I think that's fair enough. And then, as I say, we can keep those other elements to discuss next week, and then B, what we want to ask in relation to it as well. Okay, happy enough? Okay, thank you. we're now going to move on to agenda item 8, which is the implementation of the Reservoirs Act Northern Ireland 2015. We're going to get an update on the Reservoirs regulations, DFI oral evidence. At page 6 of the table papers, you'll see the clerk's memo. At page 282, you'll see DFI written evidence, further implementation of the Reservoirs Act Northern Ireland 2015. At page 285, you'll see the consultation response report. At page 321, you'll see the consultation document. So, welcome into the committee today, Alison Clydesdale, Director, Water and Drainage Policy Division, Ryan Robinson, Head of Flooding and Drainage Policy, James Kelly, Head of Rivers Operations, Violetta, hopefully I've got that right, Morrison, Head of Reservoirs Operations and Engagement Branch. Thank you very much for coming. Apologies there for the slight delay in coming to yourselves. I'm just seeking agreement as per usual that the evidence is recorded by Hansard. All agreed? Yeah? Okay, so we have obviously the consultation document and we do have the details from yourselves. In terms of what you have given to the committee. So if you don't mind, if you can make a brief opening statement in relation to it as per usual, about 5 minutes, because I'm keen to come to members' questions in relation to it. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair and members. Thank you for the invitation to brief the committee this morning on the implementation of a legislative framework for reservoir safety in Northern Ireland. Thank you for the introductions. As you're aware, the Northern Ireland Assembly agreed the Reservoirs Bill in 2015, and following royal assent it came into force as the Reservoirs Act Northern Ireland 2015. However, statutory responsibility for the Act did not transfer to DFI until 2021 due to a delay in the required transfer of functions order being made. So this policy area is actually one that has stretched over multiple Assembly mandates and various committees. So if you're content, Chair, I thought it would be helpful to just cover what has happened in that intervening period and just to set out how we now plan to implement the reservoir safety policy in Northern Ireland. Only a small number of the sections of the Act actually commenced following royal assent in 2015, and therefore in the intervening period, DFI Rivers Directorate has been limited to reminding reservoir managers of their responsibility under common law. This engagement has resulted in a number of reservoir managers taking action to improve the safety of their reservoirs, but some have not, and therefore a public safety risk remains. The Act introduces a proportionate regulatory and management framework for controlled reservoirs in order to protect people, the environment, the economy, and areas of cultural heritage from a risk of flooding due to an uncontrolled release of water from a reservoir. The Act provides that a reservoir manager is responsible for reservoir safety, and generally the reservoir manager is the person who manages or operates the reservoir. If no one manages or operates the reservoir, by default then the reservoir owner is the reservoir manager. The Act provides for a reservoir safety regime based on industry best practice and includes a registration process, designation of the reservoir, supervision of a reservoir, inspection of the reservoir, and a requirement to undertake measures required in the interests of safety. Integral to the management framework is the supervision and inspection of reservoirs by specialist civil engineers known as reservoir panel engineers. The department will establish panels of engineers, and reservoir managers will be able to commission these engineers to supervise, inspect and carry out works on a controlled reservoir. The Act requires the managers of all controlled reservoirs to register their reservoir with the department, and for the department to then give each controlled reservoir a reservoir designation. Controlled reservoirs will be given a designation of either high, medium or low consequence. High and medium consequence reservoirs will require a higher degree of regulation and management than those designated as low. Controlled reservoirs are defined as reservoirs capable of holding 10,000 cubic metres or more of water above the natural level of the surrounding land. So to give you an idea of the scale of that, that is equivalent to 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools. When the Reservoir Bill was passing through the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2015, the Assembly at that time considered the threshold and voted for the 10,000 cubic metres threshold, as flood mapping showed that even smaller reservoirs could endanger lives in the case of a breach. So there are 176 controlled reservoirs in Northern Ireland that are known to the Department. At present, approximately 68% of those are managed within the public sector through a combination of Northern Ireland Water, local councils and government departments. 25% are in private ownership and 7% are managed by not-for-profit organisations. A 2016 audit that had been requested by the then Department for Agriculture and Rural Development Committee identified 45 reservoirs as being in poor or very poor condition, and follow-up surveys conducted in 2019, 2020 and 2021 identified 11 reservoirs as needing urgent works. The department has contacted all potential reservoir managers on a regular basis to remind them of their common law responsibilities, and has provided them with reports on reservoir condition from the 2019-20 and the 2021 follow-up surveys to assist them in their responsibilities. In the absence of legislation, some reservoir managers are already voluntarily operating within the spirit of the Act, with the department conferring on them responsible reservoir managed status or condition assurance. Northern Ireland Water and many councils have received responsible reservoir manager status, and this has been helpful in relation to providing planning consultation responses for proposed development in the inundation zone of controlled reservoirs. However, this has only been an interim approach, and a public safety risk still remains without the Act being fully implemented. So the Department's proposals to further implement the Reservoir Act were consulted on between November 21 and January 22, and I would like to gratefully acknowledge the contribution of the 19 individuals and organisations who took the time to respond. The consultation, which was considered by the then Infrastructure Committee, set out the fundamental components of reservoir safety policy and included the publication of the associated draft statutory rules. The secondary legislation consulted on at that time included provisions for calculating the volume of water, how to register a controlled reservoir, the information that will be held on the publicly available controlled reservoirs register, the frequency of visits by a supervising engineer, the recording of water levels and record keeping in general, the display of emergency information, dispute referral process, stop notices, establishing the panels of reservoir engineers, provision to pay grants to reservoir managers, and forms, notices and written statements, reports and certificates that are included in the schedules of the SR. Although not included in the secondary legislation, the consultation at the time also covered the criteria that the Department will apply when giving a designation. The Department then published its consultation response on the 27th of October 2022, and this was subsequently provided to yourselves and this committee in March 2024 upon restoration of the Assembly. The main issues raised from the consultation included concerns regarding the costs associated with the introduction of the legislation and the potential for reservoirs being discontinued. The Minister recognises these concerns and that costs will be incurred for supervision and initial inspection by specialised engineers. Therefore, to address these concerns, this suite of legislation includes a power to give DFI the ability to develop a grant scheme to help reservoir managers mitigate some of the costs of compliance. The Minister has confirmed that he intends to introduce a grant scheme for those who need it to assist reservoir managers to meet their obligations under the Act. The Executive approved the progression of this suite of secondary legislation on the 17th of October 2024, and this now allows the Department to commence the majority of the remaining sections of the Act, which will introduce the key elements of the regulatory framework. The 5 pieces of legislation before you today are intertwined and interconnected, so all 5 pieces of legislation are required in order to ensure that reservoir safety policy is commenced and implemented and operated effectively. So the Department is proposing to make 2 regulations and 3 orders. 2 of the orders are commencement orders, so you have 5 SL1s before you today in your written briefing. The 2 commencement orders are simply setting out those sections of the Act that are now being commenced. Commencement order number 1 commences approximately 100 sections or part sections and 3 schedules. Commencement order number 2 commences approximately 40 sections or part sections and is subject to draft affirmative resolution, as the Act requires that some sections can only be commenced when the draft order has been laid before and approved by a resolution of the Assembly. These sections cover areas which the Assembly raised interest in at the time of the bill, such as grants. Now, it should be noted that both commencement orders must be made at the same time to ensure that the reservoir safety policy is commenced and implemented and operated effectively. The 3rd order that you have provides for the commissioning of the panel engineers. You then have 2 sets of regulations. One of those sets is negative resolution and one is affirmative resolution. So the Reservoirs NI regulations provides for the majority of the policy areas that were consulted on in the consultation document, which I covered earlier, things like the calculation of the volume, the information held on the register, recording of water levels, emergency information, dispute referral, and the notices and certificates and reports. The other set of regulations is the visits by the supervising engineers, stop notices and grants, and that's subject to draft affirmative resolution, and that covers the frequency of visits by supervising engineers, the stop notices and the payments of the grants to reservoir managers. So we welcome any questions that you may have regarding the secondary legislation and the implementation of a reservoir safety framework in Northern Ireland. However, there is a national protocol surrounding the information that can be released in relation to reservoir information, so you will appreciate that we may not be able to answer queries on individual reservoirs or reservoir managers if they fall under that protocol.
Okay, thank you. Seems like quite a number of the parts haven't been commenced, so I suppose it's maybe easier to ask what parts of the Act already commenced in 2015.
Yeah, there was only really a very small number commenced in 2015, around about 15 or so. Ryan, you maybe have the detail of those. There were very basic things like definitions and what have you.
Yeah, and the sections that commenced in 2015 did not place any operational responsibility on either reservoir managers or the department. As Alison says, it was more around definitions.
Okay. So we've now a period of time that has lapsed. So we're sitting in 2014. This came through the Assembly in 2015. A lot changes,
Right.
and a lot changes in terms of water courses as well. So in terms of classification, and you said that there was action to improve safety in some of the reservoirs that have been classified. So has there been any declassification of any of those reservoirs where there may have been safety measures put in place?
Do you mean designation?
Yeah, sorry, designation.
James, maybe you would want to come in on that?
Yeah, I suppose the designation of the reservoirs that has happened to date has almost been a provisional designation in the absence of the Act. It's like a draft or an indicative designation for that reservoir. When the Act comes in, the designation will be, and the reservoir is registered by the reservoir manager, then the reservoir will become designated. So there is some designation work, some provisional work, if you like, has been done to highlight different designations and different high designation risk to life and economic activity. Low designation wouldn't be a risk to life or economic activity. There's 3 designations there: high, medium, and low. Mm-hmm. So the designation that exists at the present time that we have spoken about, it's almost like a draft. It's not the Act isn't in force yet, so the designation isn't enacted yet. So the designation to change the provisional designation, well, really it's a provisional exercise, and that formal designation of what the designation of any reservoir is will be after the Reservoir Act is commenced and after the reservoir is registered by the reservoir manager.
Right, so just so that I have this clear in my head, so it's the 176 controlled reservoirs at the moment, they're all at this moment in time provisional designations, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so then, for example, I have a reservoir sitting in Fermanagh. They've done work to it. Is there changes to the legislation that we're going to be agreeing, or no, are they still stuck with the provisional designation that they got in 2015?
Whenever the legislation comes in, it'll be like flicking a switch and it'll be 100% on. So the day that happens, there's be a lot of we want to be sure that we're switched on before that and alert. So we're almost operating in like a draft format and like a shadow form, where reservoir managers have responsible reservoir managers is a status that we are sort of using for people who are taking on. It's a voluntary engagement that they're following the spirit of the Act, which is not yet here, which we're working towards bringing in. So it's very much that sort of provisional, shadow, voluntary, working in the spirit of engagement that a lot of our reservoir managers are doing at this time. So those designations are not yet in force. The Act is not yet enacted. So it's almost, and it's a very good and it's a very healthy thing, and we're very grateful for those that have taken 2 steps towards the Act and operating in that shadow form. So as far as the designation goes and those that are operating to it, that's a provisional, if you like, designation that has been conferred on individual reservoirs, but it's not really on any reservoir manager the legal obligation yet to do anything about that.
So let's take a step through this. So I have a reservoir in Fermanagh, okay? And I'm saying that from a local perspective, but I want to work through this. So I have a reservoir in Fermanagh, okay? They're designated as high okay?
Consequence,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're designated as high consequence. They have done work in the 9 years since, okay? Which could potentially bring them down into medium or low.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So once we hit the switch, as you have said, they will still be designated as high consequence.
Once.
If I can take it back a bit, the provisional designation was given just for the purpose of the reservoirs audit, which the department undertook in 2016. And for the purpose of that audit, we looked at all the reservoirs at the time in Northern Ireland. We gave them a provisional designation, high, medium or low. And for the purpose of the audit, we only took into account those that were high and medium. We disregarded the low consequence ones because we felt that they would only flood agricultural land, for example, whereas the medium and high, there'll be consequences to life or property or economic activity. So at the time in 2016, these reservoirs and the ones you're referring to were given a provisional designation. It's important to say this provisional designation may change once the Act comes into force, as the designation at the time considered different criteria. The criteria has been refined, has been consulted on, and Alison touched on that. Properties may have been built, depending on the geography of the reservoir. That provisional designation may or may not change.
Okay. So the designation, that'll be a cost to the groups. So say, for example, 25% they're private, 5% not-for-profit organisations. In terms of those people, that would come at a cost to them in terms of change in the designation, because they would have to maybe go through reporting, external consultations, all of that.
In terms of costing, the high or medium will place a greater degree of management on those reservoir managers compared to low consequence. So if they're high or medium, they will have to, under the Act, appoint a supervising engineer and inspecting engineer. And that will come at a cost. But I think Alison will touch more on the cost.
Yeah. So the first step when the legislation comes into place is that the reservoir managers register the reservoirs. The department is responsible for designating them. So the cost to the reservoir managers at the point at which they register, registration is free. We're not commencing the elements that introduce a fee, and there is a fee for registration in the rest of the UK. So at the moment we're not commencing those. So it is free to register, and then the department designates them, and at that point then they have to get a series of inspections, either by an inspecting engineer and a supervising engineer. The cost of those is what the Minister has recognised and is intending to bring forward a grant to support in the first instance, for people who needed the cost of those inspections. We can't say exactly what the costs of those are because obviously, they vary with each reservoir, but a ballpark figure would be somewhere in the region of, say, £5,000 for both of those inspections.
So what's the timescale for the grants to come into operation? Is that in tandem with us flicking the switch on this?
So at the moment we're just working through the business case for the grants scheme for the inspection and supervising engineer costs, the inspection costs. So we would be consulting on that, and then that would have to be approved subject to normal approvals and budget availability going forward.
Okay, slightly disappointed that the grant is not going to come in at the same time as us agreeing to this particular piece of legislation, because 25% private, 7% not-for-profit organisations, they will feel the pain of that, as soon as this comes in, as well as getting, and you could see some of those individual clubs or organisations that have ownership of it, you could see them going under, and that would have a detrimental environmental impact as well if they're not able to monitor it or hold ownership of it.
So they wouldn't see that impact at the moment the legislation comes in. There's 6 months to register, and then after that there's a period of time for to be designated. So I would estimate, and Viola, you can keep me right here, I think it's probably somewhere between maybe 12 and 18 months before those inspections would be required. By the time they register, they take 6 months to register, and then the department obviously has to do some work in terms of designating, and until they are designated, then that is what influences you need to know your designation before you get your inspection to understand what capital works. So is 12 to 18 months reasonable, Viola? Yes.
But still, we wouldn't have the business case. Well, we wouldn't have the grant scheme in place. I do want to just point to a question in relation to the grant scheme that I have, because I wasn't clear on this as well, and this is where it could get a wee bit messy in terms of the grant scheme. So in the consultation response report, it states that the funding announced in respect of NI water reservoirs was part of the PC21 process, which set out the regulator's assessment of NI water's business plan and revenue requirements for 2021-2027 period. We've just come from the regulator. The situation, the PC21 and the funding element is not a pretty sight. It is expected that the funding for the grant scheme will be provided by NI Water. How can you explain that?
No, the funding for the grant scheme for either inspection costs or capital costs will not be provided by Northern Ireland Water. Northern Ireland Water's price control provides revenue for them to operate as a company, and within that they would have health and safety responsibilities, and they would use their funding under PC21 to maintain their health and safety responsibilities in respect of safety for the reservoirs. They're already doing that, as James said, they're already acting in the spirit of the Act. So that operating revenue that the regulator approves will cover that as a health and safety responsibility. The grant for assisting with inspection costs, as the Minister has said, he's intending to bring that forward for those who need it, and that won't be required until sort of maybe at least 12 months down the line.
And that will be DFI administering that grant?
It will be DFI funding and DFI administering that, yes.
Okay, I'm going to come to members. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much for that. The Chair's covered quite a few of the points, but the first one, just in terms of the breakdown of those reservoirs, and so 176 in total, 25% are in public or in private ownership, 5% community, and the rest are owned by Northern Ireland Water or by the state or by.
We have a breakdown here. Ryan can take you through.
Yeah, please do.
Yes, of the 176 controlled reservoirs known to the department, 93 are managed by Northern Ireland Water.
Yeah.
45 are in private ownership. 18 managed by local councils. 12 are managed by various not-for-profit organisations. And 8 are actually managed by local government departments.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned then that certainly all are owned by Northern Ireland Water, but the majority anyway are operating in the spirit of the Act. Does that mean that they have carried out assessments and have done the work that needs to be done to have them ready to go as soon as it's switched on? In terms of acting in the spirit, so they've done all the work that's required in terms of assessing and are now fully up to standard?
I'll just pass. James, do you want to answer that one? And responsible reservoir status?
For those, that's exactly the term. In the legal term, when the Act comes in, it'll be reservoir manager status will be conferred on those people who are following the thing properly. Now we're calling it responsible reservoir manager status.
Yes.
So for those who have conferred on them responsible reservoir manager status, they are operating in spirit of the Act as if the Act were in.
Okay. And how many of the privately owned or council owned or community owned have been able to or have brought themselves up to that acceptable standard?
Yeah, that a few of the numbers.
Yeah, I have the numbers here. So in terms of the council, 13 have responsible reservoir manager status, and 3 have condition assurance. That's another status that the department has conferred on those that we have been provided with assurance that the reservoir is in a safe condition. In terms of the not-for-profit organisations, only 1 has condition assurance. In terms of private sector, 1 has responsible reservoir manager status and 4 have condition assurance.
Okay. And is that because they haven't been able to carry out the required assessments that are needed, haven't got the money, or haven't been able to do the work that's required on the reservoir to bring it up to the standard, or a combination of all 3?
So in terms of these statuses that the department has taken the lead in the absence of the Reservoirs Act. It's purely for planning purposes to allow development to continue where development is proposed in proximity to control reservoirs. For the responsible reservoir manager status, these individuals or organisations are acting in the spirit of the Act, and like you've just said, they have appointed supervising engineer and inspecting engineers, and are taking action to address any safety matters. In terms of condition assurance, works may not be required to those reservoirs, so for the department to be able to have that insurance in terms of our role as a statutory consultee for planning purposes, those individuals or organisations have taken a step forward and have appointed an inspecting engineer just to assure the department that their reservoir is in a satisfactory condition.
Okay.
But they have not perhaps appointed a supervising engineer or inspecting engineer, so they're not fully acting in the spirit of the Act.
And pardon my ignorance if I don't get a fully grasp of this, but in terms of where then a safety inspector is brought in to assess, there's a grant going to be for that inspectorate. Is that the case? Or is the grant going to cover any works that need to be done on the back of the inspections? So it's both?
There would be two elements to any grant. So at the moment,
so
the
it could
Minister...
be quite small.
So the Minister has...
done, but it could be huge. If
yes, we don't. You don't actually know the range of work that needs done until the inspection is done. So the first step in establishing the safety framework is to do the inspection.
Yes.
Costs, and the Minister recognises that there is a cost, particularly to the private sector and non-for-profit companies and things like small angling clubs for those assessments in the first instance.
Yes.
So those assessments need to be done first before then you can establish the capital costs.
Okay. So it's hardly surprising then those that are community owned or privately owned who maybe are struggling have done the work if they know there's a grant coming down the road to both do the assessment and the works, really, in that respect.
So any grant would not be retrospective?
No, but I mean, some have done the work to bring them up to the required standard already, but others are waiting potentially for the grant to do that work. Final point is then on the occasion where maybe a privately owned one or community owned one can't bring up the standard for whatever reason, due to lack of logistics or the cost of that, is there a process then, and if so, what is the cost of the department taking that on or passing it on to NI Water or public ownership?
So in the event that a reservoir manager, once the legislation comes in, doesn't fulfil its obligations under the Act and doesn't comply, there would obviously, as what you would expect with any legislation, there's a range of enforcement matters that can be taken forward.
Okay. And one of those ultimately could be that it is acquired.
Sorry?
One of those ultimate enforcement actions is that it will be acquired by the department or by public ownership.
No, that's not. There would be the responsibility for looking after the reservoir rests with the reservoir manager when this legislation comes in. The legislation does not have any powers where the department would take on ownership of a reservoir that wasn't complying with the Act. It does, however, provide powers for the department to step in an emergency situation to prevent public safety if there was, thought there was going to be an imminent breach or something.
Okay.
Absolutely, the Act provides powers to step in that instance, but it does not provide powers to take on ownership of those reservoirs. The legislation will place the duty on reservoir managers, and there's a range of enforcement measures if they don't comply.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, folks, for the presentation. Just on the threshold for the reservoirs to be regulated, the 10,000, 25,000, I know it is factual that the Assembly agreed it back in 2015, but I presume, your own officials and so on were, involved in that. I suppose just to go over again the rationale for that, and if it was like it was in England, how many reservoirs here would be in the over 25,000 cubic metres category?
So it's 10,000 because that's what the Assembly agreed at the time. It is also 10,000 in Wales. In England and Scotland at the moment it is 25,000, but both England and Scotland have made provision for it to come down. They've made legislative provision for the 10,000. They just haven't enacted that yet. I don't think that we have the numbers if it would be over 25,000 because we would have always been dealing with 10,000 because that's what the Assembly.
Would there be any? Would there be any here, do you think?
I think from memory, if I'm looking at the Reservoirs Bill correspondence that happened in 2014, 2015, there was this debate at the time, and the benefit of only moving from the 10,000 to the 25,000 threshold would have only benefited 10 reservoirs or so, and that would not have been taken into account. So it was agreed at the time that to stick to the 10,000 threshold for registering a controlled reservoir.
Yeah, okay. And just picking up on some of the concerns, although there's not huge numbers probably within the consultation, but within what is there is quite a bit of concern, you know, from different groups, right from small angling groups right up to, you know, the councils and so on. I think we do have to note those. And around financial assistance, I know it's been covered, but I think there's not enough detail at the minute in terms of the impact this could have on small fishing and angling clubs and so on. There is, you know, genuine concerns out there. Just, is there any indication, or, you know, what level of the grant aid will it be? Will it be 100%, or, you know, will there be additional costs, particularly to these smaller operations that are not for profit and so on?
So we're just working our way through the business case process at the moment. So the cost of an inspection is the cost of an inspection, regardless of the type of reservoir that exists. So the cost of inspections are known. We're estimating them somewhere in the region up to £5,000 for those initial inspections that need to take place at the moment. So we will be consulting on the details of the grant scheme and the thresholds and what have you, but we don't have that detail available at the moment.
Okay, but you can appreciate the concern from the sector on that. You know, obviously they'll have to go down this direction, and then with that it could be costs, and it could be crippling costs as well, and then as was said, it could fall back then with these reservoirs. You know, the future could really be under threat, so it is something to be concerned about, certainly. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Cahill?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Chair, all the questions I think have been nearly answered. Just because I remember the consultation, and obviously the grant issue was one of them, and obviously the role of the reservoir manager. I mean, just if you can, and you may not be able to do it because clearly in the SLs it's not defined exactly yet, and it may not be totally defined. Just could you expand a wee bit on the role of the reservoir manager, and also, if you can, in terms of what the grants, because I know myself, I've been dealing with a few angling clubs down my own way here who've slight concerns about, and that's their issue. Yeah. Whilst they've been good keepers of it, I mean, they're genuinely concerned. Just on the role of the response, is it, you call it the responsible manager now, is it, as opposed to the reservoir manager?
So when the legislation comes into place, it will be the reservoir manager. The definition of the reservoir manager is set out in the legislation very clearly. So it is defined as the person who owns or operates the reservoir. So in the case, for example, of an angling club, if they have a lease in place where they own and operate the reservoir, then they would become the reservoir manager.
And their responsibilities then?
And the responsibilities that come with the Act would apply to them.
Okay, and that's clearly indicated in the
That is, it's that section. Brian can give you the exact
section.
I'm only
going
I think it's section 6.
I'm not sure, but the general responsibilities would be when the Act comes in from the register, and then the department will give them the designation. Then they will have 6 months to appoint a supervising engineer, 12 months to appoint an inspecting engineer for a first initial inspection, and then it will be on the reservoir manager to address any matters in the interest of safety on that inspection report.
And Thomas, in the interim period from the Act, I know it hasn't been, see the period now over the last number of years, has there been any conversations in relation with those people out there, or people? I know you're ongoing. Yeah.
We regularly correspond with reservoir managers and have done that for the past 8-10 years. I think it's important to know that in the absence of the Reservoirs Act, there is a common law, irrespective of their assets. People should manage their assets responsibly, and in the event of failure, the common law Rylands versus Fletcher, the owner or operator will be responsible for the damage. Therefore, people should be inspecting and maintaining their reservoirs irrespective of the Reservoirs Act. However, we have evidence that this is not the case, and that's why we need this legislation.
That's okay. And in terms of, I know you can't state yet about the cost of each in terms of support grants. Mm-hmm. Can you delve in more what exactly that would entail in terms of?
You mean the capital grants? If the Minister has indicated his intention to provide for the inspection, so should the inspection show that work is needed, then it would have to be looked at. Another business case would have to be brought forward for the capital costs. At this time, we wouldn't have any evidence really to suggest what that level of cost might be.
There's not a model across anywhere else that has been used yet, is there?
There isn't, no. There isn't, and each reservoir is individual, so the works that are required is individual as well. So it's really very difficult to estimate at this point what those potential capital costs might be. But without an inspection in the first instance, you won't know even. So it is very difficult. So if the Minister decided to support further down the line capital costs, then we would bring forward another business case on that, and hopefully the inspection process would have provided more evidence in relation to the type of works that might need to be done.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Sorry, can I just come in just on a wee point there? Can I just check how many incidences that you know of that it's a case where they're not acting responsibly right now in relation to the spirit of the Act?
Of course, currently 97 of the 176 reservoirs in Northern Ireland have this responsible reservoir manager status or condition assurance, and the rest do not have. So they're not acting in the spirit of the Act.
Okay, Keith.
Okay, thanks for coming along. I have a couple of questions here. I'll fire them out. You referred 176 reservoir, and you referred to 45 as poor. Out of those 45 that's poor, are they public, private, or not-for-profit? Because if you add the private and the not-for-profit, you only get a total of 56. So the 45 that's poor, who owns them? Not obviously individual, but what sector?
That number of 45 was as a result of the 2016 audit, I believe. That has since been, then there have been follow-up surveys from 2019 and 2020 and 2021, so the 45 may have changed.
I don't have, sorry, I'm not sure if you do. Do you have
I can give you some details in regards to that. So the 2016 audit was done at the request of the then Agriculture and Rural Development Committee. For the purpose was to determine the condition of reservoirs in Northern Ireland at the time and the likely cost of bringing them up to an acceptable standard for public safety. The audit revealed that of the 105 reservoirs for which data was obtained, at the time there were 132 control reservoirs known to the department. We excluded 46 which were managed by Northern Ireland Water, as those were in satisfactory condition.
How did you establish they were satisfactory?
Northern Ireland Water were maintaining their reservoirs in the spirit of the 1975 Act in England and Wales, and they had supervising engineers and inspecting engineers appointed. The 76% of reservoirs, 45 in number, were deemed to be in poor or very poor condition. To help reservoir managers, the department carried out further surveys of those 45, and serious concerns remained in relation to at least 26. The other 19 were deemed as not needing urgent interventions by reservoir panel engineers. We were conscious that at that stage the Reservoirs Act wasn't coming in too quickly. The Assembly wasn't sitting at the time. So to be helpful to reservoir managers and to help them focus on their responsibilities, we carried out further surveys with specialist reservoir engineers in 2019, and that identified 9 reservoirs that required urgent interventions. 15 reservoirs were never surveyed in 2016, and to get a complete picture, we've been diligent and we did further surveys in 2020 and 2021, and that identified another 2 reservoirs of concern. So in total the department had concerns in relation to 11 reservoirs. We understand some works were undertaken, but we're not in a position to scrutinise or validate those works, and concerns remain. While some reservoir managers have taken action, others have not, and public safety risk remains. The majority of those were in private sector, with 1 from third sector, and were all provisionally designated as high consequence, as there are properties within the flood area of those reservoirs. And we identified over 1,000 properties at risk due to their proximity in relation to those reservoirs of concern.
So you talked about designation of a reservoir. How is that ever going to change? Because if you do a risk assessment with probability, likelihood, and then severity, okay, so additional works around a reservoir will reduce the likelihood of something happening, but the severity will stay the same. Yes, you'll reduce the risk number. So if you designate a reservoir today at high, that's never going to change, unless you can explain it different.
And that inspection regime will reflect that.
It'll never change. It's if it failed,
yes,
the likelihood of it failing will reduce, but not the severity of something, wherever it does fail.
And the inspection regime for that reservoir will be more onerous than it would be for a lesser one. But the gravity of the situation hasn't changed, so the gravity of the required level of inspection.
That'll not change theoretically.
Yeah.
So if there's 20 houses beside it or farmland, for example.
Yeah, but if it has the reservoir manager looking after it, well then it's in good order. It has confidence. It's been cared for and looked after properly. And I suppose the whole idea of the legislation is about reservoir safety. and safety of people in the vicinity of them, and that's the motivation for it. So yeah, the consequence, the number of people living within the potential inundation footprint of that reservoir won't change, but the fact that there's a regulatory regime in place and that there are inspections taking place and that they're being done by somebody, and if there are defects or whatever being highlighted, that they're being attended to within the timelines that are stipulated, that gives confidence that the reservoir has a good bill of health, for want of a better way of putting it. And it's that, and that's part of the reason why we are keen to have the legislation come in, so we have that formal regulatory role. A lot of people are working in the spirit of the legislation, and that's great, but it's not legal. So we bring that in.
So I register my reservoir, I get the inspection engineer, and I probably give him whole of the grant, because he or she will take all of the grant.
We'll be consulting on details of the grant.
They'll take all of the grant. So effectively, the inspection guy will come out and they'll take all of the grant. So I'm going to pay all of my grant probably to get a list. Does the inspection engineer assess that reservoir for fencing and access? So if somebody drowned in my reservoir and I'm a reservoir owner, am I liable based on this legislation, or is it purely if it failed and flooded somewhere? So in other words, is this also the site engineer inspecting for access to my reservoir?
The legislation, my view, is about reservoir safety, but it's the safety of the reservoir and its collapse and its inundation. Those are the responsibilities. They maybe exist at the minute with common law responsibilities.
But if the inspection engineer comes and gives me a list, I'm obliged by law to do that list. So is that list going to include access to my reservoir? Because that's going to, if that is the case, that's going to fence off every reservoir, every fishing lake in the country, if the inspection engineer puts that down his paper.
I think to clarify that, the Reservoirs Act will only look at the safety of the reservoir. So in case of a breach, what are the consequences to the downstream population in terms of people accessing a reservoir and drowning? That's a matter for the health and safety section.
So the inspection engineer will have a certain, it's purely to do with failure and breach of it, flooding. Okay. I'm just concerned about the grant. Appreciate the point about the grant and what it covers. It'll cover the inspection engineer, but he or she will leave the site with a list which will cripple any of them angling clubs. They'll not be fit to survive, because if it's small amount of work, possibly a bit of fencing, whatever. But if you're any earthworks, it's thousands of pounds. That, and how can we sign off this whenever we don't know what the grant is? It's very difficult. Leave it at that, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah. But as I said, the grant is not required until 12 or 18 months.
But at that point, the onus is then on the reservoir owner. He or she has no option. The grant could be £40.
I am concerned about that too in terms of angling clubs. I think it will have a huge detrimental impact. I think they'll fold overnight without the knowledge of what will indefinitely come in terms of a grant scheme. Mark, I'm going to come to yourself.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the evidence. I suppose we're glad to see this. It's been a long time coming. It's not a reflection on those who brought it today, but I mean, it's ridiculous that 8 years after the passage, or 9 years now after the passage of the Act, that we're only getting to this stage now. But like I said, that's not your fault. It's been between departments, and we've been between having an executive and not. I think most of the points have been made. The success or otherwise of this will come down to how it's actually funded or financed when passed. I think Alison, you said public safety issues remain without, or will remain without the Act being fully enacted. But I think even with the Act being fully enacted, unless there's adequate resource put in to the grants end of things, then those public safety concerns will remain, whether with the legislation or not. I'm sure you are aware of the dairy situation. This has been an ongoing issue with the reservoir here, where council have finally been able to step in and become the responsible reservoir manager. But I mean, it has been a huge impediment to development. You've had numerous
Could you
planning
come
applications
quickly to your question, please?
Turned down. But I was going to say, in terms of the impact that the current situation, or the vacuum, if you like, has had, not just on development or applications for new houses, but then on existing houses, or the insurance of existing houses. Do DFI now have a role, or will the reservoir managers have a role to relate these changes to insurance companies? Because we've seen insurance premiums skyrocket for houses in inundation zones that were oblivious to the fact until 8 years ago.
Well, all of the information is obviously publicly available. So in relation to insurance companies, I would have thought that they might have welcomed the introduction of this legislation, in that it's introducing safety, and therefore one would have thought minimising the risk of an uncontrolled release of water from a reservoir. So we haven't spoken to the insurance companies directly, but the information will be fully available. They already have access to flood maps in any case. They're publicly available. But obviously the enacting of the legislation would give the department more powers than it currently has at the moment.
And I know that it's envisaged the grant wouldn't be a huge amount, one would imagine. There will be one available to cover an initial inspection, and then uses hopefully the capital works as well. But there's space in between there, because Keith had expressed fear that the initial inspection will come back with a list of works that need done that will be beyond the price range of some managers. But it's also highly likely, if not inevitable, that the initial inspection will come back and say, oh, you need to get more surveying or investigatory works done, and that could cost another £100,000 or whatever. So will it bridge that gap as well, ideally?
I'm not, James, you might want to detail what an inspecting engineer does.
The inspection engineer will be an all-panel reservoirs engineer, and he will do an inspection as to the state of the reservoir in question, the controlled reservoir, more than 10,000 tonnes, 10,000 cubic metres, and he will highlight issues in the matter of safety that are required to be done. The supervising engineer will then monitor that, but that inspection by the inspecting engineer will be required. Is it 10 years, Phila? 10 years for the inspection engineer to do his. So there will be required to be an inspection at the start to work out what, if anything, is required at these reservoirs. And then the supervising engineer will then keep an eye, monitor that those matters in the interests of safety, which have been identified by the inspecting engineer, are attended to in a timely manner. And then the inspecting engineer will come back again 10 years hence, really, unless something else has happened, or there's a change, or somebody wants to do works or something like that, that will require some supervision. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
So the inspecting engineer will be qualified to inspect and assess everything?
Yes, he's a panel engineer.
So without having to require, further agents to come in, or experts to come in at huge additional cost.
He or she will be the expert, yes.
Good. No. And in terms of grant, we obviously have the chair had expressed concerns that Northern Ireland Water might not have the money for that. The department itself isn't in a particularly healthy situation. But have you looked not just at the funding of that, but how that might be designed in terms of priority? Will it be a first come, first served, or will you have them ranked in terms of higher priority, lower priority? Has any consideration been given to that, or do you just want to get beyond this stage first?
Well, that's what we're looking at the minute with the business case. So the Minister has confirmed that he intends to introduce a grant for those who need it, and that is the criteria that we're looking at the moment.
And there'll be no restrictions in terms of eligibility, like say for example a council, will councils be eligible to apply?
The eligibility criteria will have to be consulted on, and that's something that we'll have to agree with the Minister in due course.
Okay, no, thank you anyway, thanks.
Okay, Andrew.
Thank you. Just going back there a wee bit there to the we talk about 45% not in a satisfactory condition and such like. And I was just sort of wondering, what would require and what what state of a reservoir would be in to require an urgent intervention, if that makes sense. What are we talking about here?
It's probably useful to point out that if a reservoir is poor, or if it's very poor, it doesn't automatically follow that the reservoir is not stable.
Okay.
If that reservoir to require a drawdown or an emergency drawdown or something like that to lower the water level in that reservoir, and it didn't have the pipes or the capacity or the sluices or the exit or the escape to do that, that would be very poor.
Right.
So it doesn't automatically follow just because a reservoir is classed as poor or very poor that it's not stable. I'm not sure if that...
No, that makes...
But it does, there may well be other things that are required as well, and each one is on its own, and I think it reflects a wee bit. A lot of the reservoirs here are very old. A lot of reservoirs here are more than 100 years old, and they're not getting any better by themselves, and I suppose that brings us round to the importance of the legislation and the safety element of it and the requirement for the Act.
And then I suppose... is that then included on the fact that we are experiencing, more intense bouts of weather and rain? Is that sort of reflected in that, therefore, that this needs to be done?
Well, we're operating in that context, yes, with the climate and the weather that we have and the changes that are coming to us. But I think this train pulled out a long time ago, and we're still working towards getting to that destination of having that Reservoirs Act. Yes, the weather and the amount of water moving about can only potentially exacerbate things, but each reservoir nearly needs to be assessed on its own. That consider the circumstance, the catchment, what's around it, the volume of it, the vulnerability of it, what's downstream of it, and how it's served, how it's constructed, and any other measures around and about it that may make it vulnerable to reservoirs similar size, maybe entirely different scenarios depending on where they are.
Two more questions. I suppose the next question follows on from the point Mr. Durkin was making there about the engineers and the qualifications of them. I suppose are there enough in Northern Ireland to do this job, or is there, is that going to throw up a whole pile of problems, do you think, or do you envisage, or?
These engineers tend to be multinationals, willing to travel, so availability will not be an issue. And the Institution of Civil Engineers in London maintains a Reservoirs Committee that scrutinises applications, and under our Act, the Institution of Civil Engineers will give a recommendation to the department. It will be a departmental appointment to a specific reservoir panel.
Okay. One last. No, and again, just because this is now legislation as such, or will be legislation as such, what will the potential repercussions be for a reservoir manager that or whatever who does not undertake sufficient works in order to to bring said reservoir up to standard? I mean, what do you envisage there?
So in the legislation there are a range of enforcement sanctions that will be enacted as part of this suite of legislation. They range across a lot of areas. So there are sanctions if you don't register, there are different sanctions if you don't comply with the stop notice, that type of thing.
Okay, so are they financial issues, or or what, judicial, or what?
Yes, there are. Rand, do you want to cover the main bits of that?
There can be penalties, financial penalties, and various sanctions, but it's really dependent on the offence and the scale of the risk to safety.
Thank you, Chair.
Can you clarify for me exactly what the enforcement elements will be, just as set out in the legislation, what that will be? Because we're talking about small groups here of men that go out, fishing is a hobby, and this is a recreational thing for these people, and they're taking on management of a reservoir and could have serious consequences placed upon them. So just outline exactly what enforcement will mean.
Yep, sure. So the enforcement clauses are set out in the SRs that were published with the consultation. I can go through them. It might take me a while. Section 16 provides for an offence for reservoir manager to fail to comply with the registration process. And sections 3 and 4 set out the maximum penalties for anybody found guilty of an offence under that. Section 38 provides enforcement in relation to supervision, inspection and record keeping if they don't keep records. Section 52 sets out more enforcement in relation to commissioning of engineers. Section 53 also sets out enforcement issues in relation to other sections of the Act. There's an awful lot of detail. Would it be easier if I write to you to detail the enforcement?
That is yes, please, because this is a problem that we have in relation to being able to decide upon the SL1s. And I'm speaking as myself as chair. I am not confident that I have enough information. Under it states, I'm looking at the first SL1 that's going to be under consideration here. And under the purpose of the statutory rule, I have one line. And the line is that the statutory rule will commence further sections of the Reservoirs Act Northern Ireland 2015. Now, I could go and research all of that and take a look and try and tally it up. But I want to see that in black and white in front of me, exactly what I am deciding upon under that SL1. I am really deeply concerned about the fact that we do not have the detail. You're saying we're going to have to go out and consult in relation to the grant scheme, and that is going to, there is going to be clubs will fold. There's going to be reservoirs that are going to be, left sitting. I do genuinely believe that. And as someone that comes from the Fermanagh Lakelands, it is a concern for me. And I don't feel I have enough information, so I would appreciate some more detail back in writing in relation to it.
Enforcement?
Well, in terms of the SL1s that have been provided to the committee, I don't feel that there was enough detail, but we're obviously going to come to that bit now in a minute, and that'll be for the committee to decide. But I would like some further information in relation to the elements that the SL1s will relate to, and contained within the Act that we have to decide upon. There is, 140 odd in part in number 1, 70 odd I think in number 2. I want to see exactly the detail of where that relates to.
Okay, so the SRs were published as part of the consultation document that the previous committee received. So the full detail of the SRs is published and is part of the consultation document, along with their explanatory note.
And today, this committee has the SL1s in front of them, and this committee has to decide on the SL1s. And I'm speaking myself, I don't feel I have enough detail in relation to exactly where that all sits. So if you could provide us in writing with some of that information for the committee, that would be useful. Okay. Andrew, are you okay with? You're all okay with your questions there?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, I don't think there was anybody else indicating. So I want to thank you for your evidence. If you could remain there just a wee minute to see what the rest of the committee obviously feels in relation to the SL1s, because I might need you to obviously explain some of the detail if we do move to agreeing to them. So I'm advising members that there are 5 proposals for the subordinate legislation related to the Reservoirs Act Northern Ireland 2015 that have been included on the agenda for consideration by the committee. However, the SL1s provided do not contain detailed information on the purpose or policy implications of each of the proposed statutory rules. So I'm reminding members that the SL1 stage of subordinate legislation is important. It is the only opportunity for a committee to influence the legislation. Subordinate legislation cannot be amended once it has been laid. It is therefore important that the committee is content and that it has all the information it believes is necessary to help make an informed decision. So I'm asking members if they wish to proceed with their consideration of the proposals today, or if they wish to defer consideration and ask the Department to provide updated SL1s providing more detailed information on the policy implications of the proposed rules, and to schedule oral evidence when additional information is available. Members, how do you feel?
Chair, I want to just talk, suppose, broadly about all of this. To be fair, you've answered a lot of questions, and it's all good stuff, and it's a good understanding. And whenever you look at the consultation, a lot of it's in there. But in a consultation and in the SL1, not being rude, is not the same thing to me. So if the information relevant to the SL1 is in a paragraph, well, 1 paragraph or 4 pages or 40 pages, so be it. But we're signing off the SL1, not the consultation. Yeah. And I appreciate this. My main concern is support for the groups and what that's going to be. Yeah. And fundamentally, yes, you can get support for to do the inspection, but that's only to get you a list. Then there's going to be no support after that. So I personally am not content with what I have. Yes, there's a lot of stuff in the consultation, but you've too many pieces tied together. Yep. And if we get this wrong, it's wrong. I'd rather have it in SL1, or at least a link in SL1 to a certain document which is relevant to the SL1, but not deciphering it out of the consultation. Okay, thank you. Mark, were you indicating there?
Yeah, Chair, happy enough with your proposal seeking further information. We've waited long enough for this. I suppose to wait another while won't hurt, but information of the implications of this subordinate legislation and the implications of not proceeding down this route. So then we're still in that halfway house where there is legislation that's not fully enacted. But not happy enough to support your proposal.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, Chair, what?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm coming to Andrew first.
No, just yeah, I think so. We concur with what's gone before. Just a question: so how does this affect the timelines of things? If that makes sense, does this pause at all, or does things move on concurrently, Chair? Yeah. So I think there is a bit of. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think there is a bit of time. Because I think it's looking towards it being led in the Assembly in the new year. Am I correct in that?
So the 5 pieces of legislation are intertwined, and therefore the advice we have from OLC is that all 5 pieces need to go forward together. So 2 of the pieces are draft affirmative, and those are the pieces that cover the grant scheme. That is what would be debated in the chamber. It's maybe useful just to say as well, because I realise I haven't said this, there is no grant scheme for reservoir safety elsewhere in the UK. England, Scotland and Wales do not have a grant, and in those jurisdictions reservoir managers are required to meet all the costs. So Northern Ireland is alone in that respect. But the elements of the legislation that cover the grant are subject to draft affirmative and will be debated in the Assembly. The other pieces of negative resolution would normally be laid if they were approved today, but because we've been advised by OLC that this all needs to come in together, we probably wouldn't be laying the negative until the 2 pieces of draft affirmative were approved, because if we laid some of it and then it wasn't approved, it wouldn't work, because we need the whole 5 pieces together.
Okay. Happy, Andrew? Yep.
No, Chair, I was, because it was part of the whole process and I understand it. I mean, I've been happy enough to move on today, but I'll accept that all the people want information, and I don't have no objections to that. I mean, it's like it's been said, we're going to have this debate in the chamber anyway, in terms of the major factors that's impacting us. But listen, if the majority of the committee wants more information, listen, I'll not be
content with that too, Chair.
Sorry?
I'm content with that course of action as well, Chair.
Okay. Well, look, we're asking then, obviously, to provide updated SL1s, providing more detail on the purpose and the implications of each statutory rule. And obviously, as I put to the committee, we would like to have another oral evidence session at a suitable date whenever we have all those details, because I just think it is important that we do get this right. And I think it's important that we are content and we see, as Keith said, agreeing to something that is contained within the consultation is one thing, but having it in the SL1 is another. Committee content with that? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for your evidence today and for your attendance. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, members, in that case, I'm seeking that we move then to item agenda 14. Content, yeah. Okay, so this is the SR 2024-187 and it's a Cooper's Mill Park, Dundonald, Abandonment Order, Northern Ireland 2024 from pages 450 to 456, documents in relation to the statutory rule. The rule is subject to negative resolution. And 4 members, the purpose of the rule is to abandon an area of 16.41 square metres of road, former road to the rear of the footway fronting number 1D Cooper's Mill Park, Dundonald. The area of road in question will be abandoned as the department is of the opinion that it is no longer necessary. On the coming into operation of the rule, the area of road in question shall cease to be maintainable by the department and the public right-of-way over it shall be extinguished. The rule is due to come into operation on the 9th of December 2025. Remind members that having sought further information on the process of regularisation in respect of the abandonment orders, the committee agreed that it was content with the proposal for the statutory rule at its meeting on the 23rd of October 2024. Inform members that the examiner of statutory rules has not yet reported on the rule but has indicated that it will be included in her next report to the Assembly and that she's no comment to make. So are members content with the statutory rule? Content, yeah? Okay, so I'm reading the motion that the Committee for Infrastructure has considered SR 2024-187, the Coopers Mill Park Dundonald Abandonment Order, Northern Ireland 2024, and has no objection to the rule. Okay, item 15 is SR 2024-188, the Drumna Walk Lurgan Abandonment Order, Northern Ireland 2024, from pages 459 to 464, documents in relation to the statutory rule. The rule is subject to negative resolution. Inform members that the purpose of the rule is to abandon 809 square metres superseded road at Drumna Walk Lurgan, comprising 2 areas of road consisting of 88 square metres commencing at a point 24 metres southeast of its junction with Ansborough Road and 721 square metres commencing at a point 79 metres northeast of its junction with Ansborough Road and extending for 121 metres in a northeasterly direction. The rule is due to come into operation on the 9th of December 2025. Remind members that having sought information on the process of regularisation in respect of abandonment orders, the committee agreed it was content with the proposal for the statutory rule at its meeting on the 23rd of October 2024. And 4 members that the examiner of statutory rules has not yet reported on the rule but has indicated that it will be included in her next report to the Assembly and that she has no comment to make. Are members content with the statutory rule? Okay, so the motion is that the Committee for Infrastructure has considered SR 2024-188, the Drumna Walk Lurgan Abandonment Order, Northern Ireland 2024, and has no objection to the rule. Okay, item 16 is SR 2024-190, the Waring Street Lurgan Abandonment Order, Northern Ireland 2024. From pages 466 to 474, documents in relation to the statutory rule. The rule is subject to negative resolution. Inform members that the purpose of the rule is to abandon an area of 300 square metres of former road on Waring Street, Lurgan, comprising a car park from a point 17 metres south-west of its junction with Millennium Way and continuing for 29 metres in a northwesterly direction. On the coming into operation of the rule, the department will no longer be responsible for maintenance of the area of road in question and the public right-of-way over it shall be extinguished. The rule is due to come into operation on the 9th of December 2025. Inform members that having sought further information on the process of regularisation in respect to the abandonment orders, the committee agreed it was content with the proposal for the statutory rule at its meeting on the 23rd of October 2024. And 4 members that the examiner of statutory rules has not yet reported on the rule, but it has indicated that it will be included in her next report to the Assembly and she's no comment to make. Are members content with the statutory rule? Okay, so the motion is that the Committee for Infrastructure has considered SR 2024-190, the Waring Street Lurgan Abandonment Order, Northern Ireland 2024, and has no objection to the rule. Item 17 is the Marcus Ward Street Belfast Abandonment Order, Northern Ireland 2024. At page 474 is the SL1 proposal for the statutory rule. And 4 members that the proposed rule will abandon an area of 28.66 square metres of land extending for 37.98 metres to the rear of the footway of Marcus Ward Street, Belfast. The department states that abandonment has been requested by Kainos Managers Limited to facilitate redevelopment of the site. The bed and soil of the area of the land to be abandoned is owned by Kainos Managers Limited, and following the abandonment the land will be incorporated within the redeveloped site. The department advises that there was no objections were received in response to the consultation for the rule. So I'm asking members, are you content with the proposal for the statutory rule? Content? Thank you. 18 is subordinate legislation. SR is not subject to assembly procedure. Advise members that there's one statutory rule that is not subject to assembly proceedings, is not required to be laid. This is at pages 478 of the meeting pack and is SR 2024-193, the road speed limit number 5, order Northern Ireland 2024. Remind members that the committee noted the proposal for the statutory rule at its meeting on the 6th of November. So are members content to note the statutory rule? Yep. Thank you. Item 19 is subordinate legislation SL1 not subject to assembly proceedings. There are 3 proposals, SL1 for statutory rules that are not subject to assembly proceedings, are not required to be laid. These are listed at pages 483, 490 to 490, pages 483 to 492, and are the SL1, the waiting restrictions Whitehead Order, Northern Ireland 2024, the SL1, the waiting restrictions Drapers Town Order, Northern Ireland 2024, and the SL1, the schools part-time 20 mph speed limit, amendment number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2024. So I'm asking members if they have any issues they wish to raise on any of the proposals. Keith, yeah.
This is just a broad question about the 20 mile hour thing. I know it's not relevant to this, but it's a broader question where it says a 20 mile hour limit is indicated by means of a variable message traffic sign. Okay, so say in the future that turned into the SID, does that piece of legislation still cover that? I know it's not relevant to this, and I'm happy enough for this one, but it's just a broader question. So is a SID a variable message traffic sign? So you know these have been done for loads of 20 mile hours outside schools. Yeah. And they'll probably unlikely to change till a SID, but if there was a SID put up, does that terminology cover it? I'm happy enough for this one, but it's a broader question.
Yeah, no,
if you understand what I mean.
Fair point, and with that noted. Keith, thank you. Okay, any other items anybody wishes to raise or happy? Happy, yeah. Yep. So members are content with the proposals for the statutory rules. Content, yeah. Okay, item 20 is the active travel delivery plan, Department for Infrastructure, public consultation, written evidence. So at page 494 is the active travel delivery plan consultation. At page 571 is the active travel delivery plan delivery plan questionnaire. For members that the consultation on active travel delivery plan was launched on the 13th of November and will run until the 28th of February. So at this moment in time, there's nothing really that we can do until the consultation comes back to us in terms of the committee. So I'm asking members as they content to note the update and consider the matter further when the results of the consultation are available, or if any further information is needed from anybody or clarification. Are you content with that approach? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So item 21 is the forward work programme. At page 647 is a draft forward work programme. So earlier I said in the committee that we will be looking next week in terms of an informal strategic planning session, but I want to just inform members that an oral evidence session with the Interim Regional Planning Commission have been scheduled to take place at the next meeting on the 27th of November. However, due to the availability of Commission members, they are no longer able to attend and have asked for the session to be rescheduled. So we will be rescheduling that again, because I know we're very keen to hear from the Planning Commission, But it is suggested the committee instead holds that in short informal meeting to deal with the correspondence or legislation, which will be followed by an informal planning, strategic planning session. And this will be useful time for the committee to review the work undertaken to date and decide if there are any particular areas we wish to consider in greater detail. So please do still plan to attend and come along to that session next week, because I think we need to pull together all the threads that we have been looking at.
I just want to clarify, actually, it said informal in the brief.
Sorry.
Short and formal, and that was my mistake. It's a formal meeting in advance of an informal session.
Yeah, sorry.
So, yes.
Apologies.
That was me.
You're grand, no problem. So I'm seeking agreement from the members that we proceed with the evidence sessions as set out in the draft for work programme and to reflect any decisions taken today. Happy? Yeah. Item 22, any other business. I'm just asking members if they have any other business that they wish to raise right now. I just do want to go back in relation to the last session that we had there in terms of the Reservoirs Act. Just because I'm deeply concerned over that grant scheme, would members be content if we write to the Minister to see exactly where that business case is sitting at this moment in time, and get some further detail around that element, the time scales of it as well? Would members be content with that? Yeah? Okay. Anything? Sorry, Mark, did you want to come in?
Content with that, Chair.
Okay, so members, the date, time and location of the next meeting will take place at 10 a.m. on Wednesday the 27th of November 2024 in room 29 Parliament Buildings at 10 a.m. Be safe on the roads, it's icy out there, take your time and safe home. Thank you, and I adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, Chair.
Committee Room 29, Sound.